The day the Galactic Conclave voted to exile Earth, I was sitting in the third row of the observation gallery, and I could feel it before a single hand was raised. My name is Yara Osei. I had been Earth's ambassador to the Conclave for 11 years, 4 months, and 16 days. I kept count because the Conclave itself kept count of everything. Every infraction, every deviation, every moment humanity failed to fall in line with what they considered civilized behavior. I figured if they were going to measure us, I might as well measure them right back. The chamber was enormous. It had been built to accommodate 424 member species, and it did so in a way that made each one feel both significant and very small at the same time. The ceiling was a dome of reinforced crystal, and through it you could see open space, stars and nebulae, and the distant smear of the galactic core, all of it hanging above the delegates like a reminder of how much universe there was, and how little of it any single species truly owned. I had grown to hate that ceiling. Not because it was ugly. It was breathtaking, actually, even after 11 years of staring at it. I hated it, because every species in that room looked up at it and felt comfort, felt belonging, felt the weight of a shared civilization pressing down on them in a reassuring way. When I looked up at it, I felt something different. I felt watched. That morning, the atmosphere in the chamber was different in a way I could not have explained to anyone who had not spent years learning to read alien body language. The Velkari were clustered together more tightly than usual, their four-armed bodies angled slightly inward, their iridescent scales flat against their skin, rather than raised in the casual display they used during normal sessions. Flat scales on a Velkari meant discomfort, or guilt. The Thune Cooperative's delegates had arranged their biomasses. They were beings of connected cellular tissue, something like enormous, intelligent coral colonies, into a configuration I had only seen twice before. Once before a censure vote against the Dravali, once before the vote to strip the Marith Collective of their lane access rights. I had my answer before the High Arbiter even called the session to order. The charges against Earth were read by a junior clerk, a young Velkari who stumbled slightly over the pronunciation of human place names and then recovered with professional smoothness. Persistent violation of the non-escalation accords, unauthorized development of restricted weapons categories, failure to submit to the Unified Biological Census Program, cultural contamination of 3 protected developing species. I listened to all of it with my hands folded on the railing in front of me, and my face as neutral as I could keep it. The non-escalation accords had been written by species that had never faced extinction from within their own atmosphere. The biological census was a polite word for genetic mapping that had already been used twice to economically disadvantaged species whose biology made them inconvenient trading partners. The weapons charges were genuine, but then every member species had unauthorized weapons programs, and everyone in that chamber knew it. And the cultural contamination claim referred to 3 separate incidents where human art, human music, and one particular human children's book had spread to developing civilizations and been adopted enthusiastically by those civilizations young. We had been accused, essentially, of being contagious. The debate portion of the session lasted 3 hours. I was not permitted to speak. Earth's representative was allowed to observe and allowed to submit a written response, but the Conclave had ruled 18 months earlier that the nature of the charges against humanity required a structured process, and a structured process meant I sat quietly while 423 other species decided what to do with us. I watched the speakers, I counted the alignments. By the second hour, I knew the count would be somewhere above 400 in favor of exile. The only real question was whether the 3 delegations I had spent the last 6 weeks quietly meeting with would find the courage to abstain rather than vote with the majority. The Arith-san ambassador caught my eye at one point during the 3rd hour. The Arith-san communicated through pressure changes in the air around them, a form of speech that translated only imperfectly into anything humans could hear. But their faces were remarkably expressive, in a way that needed no translation. What I read in that face was something close to an apology. I gave the smallest possible nod. I understood. When the High Arbiter called the vote, the chamber went very quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of a large room where everyone stops talking. The kind of quiet that has weight to it. The kind that settles over a space when everyone in it knows they are doing something that cannot be undone. The vote was displayed on the central screen above the Arbiter's platform in the numerical script that all Conclave members could read. The numbers climbed as delegations registered their choices. 421 in favor, 3 abstaining, 1 opposed. The one opposed was my own submission, entered on Earth's behalf, which had exactly as much effect on the outcome as a single raindrop has on a river. The High Arbiter raised her 6 hands. She was a Thuan-adjacent species, and her arms were long and pale and moved like ribbons in wind, and spoke the formal declaration in galactic standard. Earth was exiled from the conclave. All hyperspace lane access to and from the Sol system would be suspended within 30 days. Trade relations would be severed. Any member species found to be providing material assistance to Earth during the exile period would face secondary sanctions. She said it in the calm, measured tone of someone reading a weather report. I stood up. The chamber noticed. There was a ripple of movement through the delegates as I got to my feet. I was not supposed to stand. I was not supposed to speak. The protocol for this moment was clear. Earth's observer would exit through the gallery door on the left, and the session would continue with discussion of the implementation timeline. I stood, and I looked out at 424 delegations, and I said 7 words. You have made a very large mistake. There was a pause of perhaps 2 seconds. Then 4 security officers in conclave uniforms appeared at my sides, and they walked me out of the chamber in a manner that was firm but technically polite, because the conclave prided itself on being technically polite about everything. The gallery door closed behind me with a soft click that sounded, in that corridor, like something breaking. I walked to my quarters in the diplomatic wing. I did not run. I did not look at the Velkari clerks who were processing paperwork at their stations as I passed, though I felt their eyes on me. I walked at a normal pace, turned the lock on my door, sat down at my desk, and opened a secure channel. The channel used a quantum-entangled relay that was the single most classified piece of technology Earth possessed. 4 people knew it existed. One of them had built it in a basement in Geneva 15 years ago, during a long night with cold coffee and the clear-eyed certainty that this day was coming. Her name was Dr. Agnes Ford, and she had told me then that the galaxy would eventually get around to formalizing what it already felt about us, and that we should be ready. We had spent 15 years getting ready. The message I sent contained no words. Words could be intercepted, analyzed, and translated even through heavy encryption given enough time. What I sent was a 12-digit numerical code that looked, to any system that might intercept it, like a routine calibration signal for a piece of navigation equipment. To Agnes Ford and 3 other people on Earth, it translated to 4 words. They did it. Begin. I sat back in my chair and looked at the small window in my quarters. Through it, I could see the same stars visible through the conclave's crystal dome, though from a different angle. They looked the same as they always had. They did not know anything had changed. They would not know for a while. But things had changed, enormously and permanently, and with no possibility of reversal. I thought about the 11 years I had spent in that chamber. I thought about the hundreds of meetings, the thousands of diplomatic dinners, the careful and exhausting work of presenting humanity as something the galaxy could learn to trust. I had been good at it. I had genuinely believed in it for most of those 11 years. I had believed that patience and consistency and demonstrated good faith would eventually shift the conclave's view of us from threat to partner. I had been wrong, and I had known I was wrong for the last 3 years, and I had kept doing the work anyway, because that is what you do when the work still matters, even when you know how it ends. My comm unit buzzed. It was my assistant, a young man named Colin Hart, who had been with me for 2 years, and who was absolutely not going to believe what I was about to tell him. I answered. "Ambassador," Colin said, "I've just seen the vote results on the public feed. I'm so sorry. What do we do now? Are we supposed to be packing? Is there a departure protocol? The conclave hasn't sent us anything yet, but I assume we have 30 days to—" "Colin," I said. He stopped. "Pack your personal items. Leave everything that belongs to the mission. We will be departing within 72 hours. 72 hours? But the protocol says 30 days. I know what the protocol says. There was a pause on his end. Colin Hart was 26 years old and had grown up wanting to be a diplomat because he believed in the power of conversation to solve problems. He was talented and earnest, and he had learned a great deal in 2 years at my side. What he had not yet fully learned was how to recognize the moment when conversation was over. Something is going to happen, isn't it? He said. It was not quite a question. Many things, I said. Pack light, Colin. We leave at 0600 on the third day. I ended the call. Then I sat in my chair for a long time and thought about the 3 abstentions. The Areth San had abstained. The Pale Communion of Vesh had abstained. And someone in the Velkari delegation, not the ambassador, who had voted in favor with the rest of her government's bloc, but a dissenting council member who had broken from her own government's position at enormous personal and professional cost, had entered an abstention rather than a favorable vote. 3 out of 424. In any mathematical sense, 3 was nothing. 3 was a rounding error. 3 changed the number on the board from 421 to 421 without making any difference to the outcome. But I am a diplomat. I have spent my career understanding that numbers are only part of what a vote reveals. A vote also reveals character. A vote also reveals, if you look carefully, who will be standing with you when the mathematics are more favorable. I made 3 notes in my personal journal, not in the official mission logs, which were conclave property and would be retained when we departed, in my own journal, which was encrypted with a key that only I held. 3 names, 3 reasons for hope that had nothing to do with the current situation and everything to do with what came next. Outside my window, the stars continued their patient burning. The galaxy had just done something it thought was decisive. It had taken a vote. It had passed a resolution. It had formalized a position on humanity's place in the cosmic order. What it had not done, what 421 delegations, in their certainty and their relief, and their carefully managed sense of righteousness, had completely failed to do, was ask what humanity had been building for the last 15 years, while we all watched them argue about us. They had focused on the vote. We had focused on what came after the vote. There is an old saying on Earth, very old, from a time before we had satellites or aircraft, or even reliable maps of our own planet. It goes like this: while the lion watches the gate, the mouse learns the walls. I did not share this saying with the Galactic Conclave. I had shared very little with the Galactic Conclave that I did not have to share. That was one of the few decisions I had made in 11 years that I was entirely at peace with. 72 hours. Then home. And 30 days after that, the galaxy was going to learn something that no resolution, no vote, and no exile decree had the power to change. Earth was not gone. Earth had never been what they thought it was. And humanity, in the patient and precise way it has always approached the things that matter most, had been preparing for this exact moment since long before the conclave thought to call it a problem. I closed my journal. I poured myself a glass of water from the dispenser on my desk. I drank it slowly. Then I began to write my formal resignation from the ambassadorial post, because whatever came next, it would not be diplomacy. Not in the way the conclave understood the word. It would be something older, something the galaxy had no cultural framework to anticipate. It would be humanity deciding, for the first time since we reached the stars, to stop explaining ourselves. The next morning I walked through the diplomatic wing, one last time, before Colin and I began packing. I had walked this corridor thousands of times. I knew every panel in the floor, every slight variation in the artificial lighting, every spot where the recycled air smelled faintly of the Velkari cleaning compound that the station's maintenance crew favored. I had spent 11 years of my life in this place. I had eaten 3,000 meals in the diplomatic cafeteria on sub-level 4. I had slept in a bed made for a human body, in a room designed for an entirely different species of being. I had learned to navigate a building built by creatures with 6 limbs, to use interfaces designed for beings with 3 sets of eyes, to work in an environment where every single thing was subtly, constantly, structurally not made for me. And I had done it without complaint because that was the job, because someone had to do it, because Earth believed, for a long time, that the path to a seat at the table was to show up and do the work, even when the table itself had been built to keep you standing. I stopped at the window at the end of the corridor. The view from here was different from my quarters. You could see the docking bays from this angle, and in the nearest bay, still berthed on its standard pad, sat the small diplomatic transport that had been my way in and out of this station for 4 years. It was a modest ship by any standard, Earth-built, silver-gray hull with the blue circle emblem of the United Nations on its flank, capable of short hyperspace jumps, comfortable for a crew of 12, entirely unintimidating in every possible way. I had always thought it was the right kind of ship for a diplomat to arrive in, something that said, "We come with papers, not weapons." Standing there looking at it, I thought about all the other ships that were currently dark and quiet in the outer reaches of the Sol system. Ships that said something entirely different. Ships that the galaxy did not know existed because we had been very, very careful about keeping them in the dark. I thought about Fleet Admiral Dominica Vasquez, who had been sitting in the black silence of the Oort cloud for the better part of a year, with a force that would have rearranged the power dynamics of this entire region of the galaxy, if anyone had known it was there. Dominica was not a diplomat. She was not patient in the way diplomats learn to be patient, through slow erosion and careful management of one's own responses. She was patient in the way engineers are patient, with precise purpose, working toward a specific outcome, counting down with absolute certainty that the countdown ends somewhere. I had spoken to her exactly once in the months leading up to this day. A brief call through the same classified relay I had used the night before. She had asked me one question. "Are they going to vote the way we think they're going to vote?" I had said yes. She had said, "Then I'll see you on the other side of this." And that was that. I turned away from the window and went to find Colin, who had, bless him, already begun packing the mission files in exactly the way protocol required, separating Earth property from Conclave property with the meticulous attention to procedure that had made him an excellent assistant and would probably, given time, make him an excellent diplomat. Though I suspected that the word diplomat was going to mean something somewhat different by the time Colin Hart was in a position to use it as a title. "How long until we can file departure clearance?" I asked. "The Conclave's transit authority requires 48 hours notice for diplomatic departure," he said without looking up. "We're within window. I filed the notice this morning. Departure is confirmed for 0600, day 3. "Good." He looked up then. He had the look of someone who had something to say, and was carefully deciding whether to say it. "Ambassador," he said, "I've been reading the exile provisions. The 30-day grace period applies to mission staff as well. We are entitled to remain in station for 30 days for the orderly conclusion of any ongoing negotiations or pending agreements. I know. There are 7 pending agreements. 2 of them are minor, but the Dravali Water Rights Compact has been in discussion for 9 months, and it is, technically, almost ready for signature. Staying for the full 30 days would allow us to at least—" "Colin," he stopped. "The Dravali Water Rights Compact," I said carefully, "is a document that the Dravali government has been using as a means to delay a separate and more significant access agreement for 14 months. It was never going to be signed. It was a stalling mechanism, and a very good one, and I let it run, because it was useful to me to keep the Dravali delegation occupied and feeling productive while I focused on other things." Colin stared at me. "We are leaving in 72 hours, I said, "because in 72 hours, the calculus of this station will have changed enough that staying longer will no longer serve any purpose I am interested in serving." He put down the file he was holding. "What's going to happen?" I considered the question. "Something the galaxy hasn't seen before," I said. "Pack your warm layers. I always find space travel cold." I left him with that and returned to my quarters to finish my own preparations. On my desk, the formal resignation letter sat in its completed form, ready to be transmitted to Geneva. I looked at it for a moment. Then I opened a secondary file and began to write something else. Not a resignation, not a report, something between a letter and a record, addressed to no one in particular, and meant for whoever eventually needed to understand how we had arrived at this point. I wrote about the vote. I wrote about the faces of the delegates as the numbers climbed. I wrote about the 3 abstentions, and what I believed they meant, not politically, but as a statement about something more fundamental than politics. I wrote about the corridor outside my room, and the diplomatic transport in the bay, and the 11 years I had spent arriving and departing through that bay with paperwork instead of weapons. And then I wrote one more thing, a thing I had never put into any official document in my entire career. I wrote about what it felt like to be the representative of a species that the rest of the galaxy feared, and to know that the fear was not entirely wrong, and to spend every waking hour performing a version of humanity that was accurate enough to be believed, but careful enough not to confirm what everyone already suspected. It was exhausting work. It was the most important work I had ever done, and it was over now, and I was not entirely sorry. The galaxy had decided what it thought we were. Now it was going to find out whether it had decided correctly. I saved the file. I sealed it with a personal encryption key. I labeled it with a date and the words, "For the record, when it matters." Then I went to sleep, because whatever was coming next, I intended to be rested for it. 8 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days of silence. My name is Dominica Vasquez. I hold the rank of Fleet Admiral in the United Earth Naval Command, and for the better part of a year, I have been dead to the universe. Not literally. Obviously not literally. But to every sensor array, every long-range scanner, every hyperspace detection network in this region of the galaxy, the 17 ships under my command do not exist. We have no emissions, no active drives, no communication signals, no heat signature above the natural background radiation of open space. We have been sitting in the cold and dark of the Oort cloud, that great distant halo of frozen rock and ancient ice that surrounds our solar system, like stones on the bottom of a very deep ocean. The crew calls it the long quiet. It started as a complaint. By the 4th month, it had become something else, a kind of identity, a shared condition that everyone in the fleet had made their peace with in their own way. The crew of the carrier platform Arthur Baines ran evening study groups, rotating through subjects based on whoever wanted to teach that week. Lieutenant Commander Owen Gibbs on the destroyer Steadfast had written what he described as a novel, but which was actually, by any fair assessment, closer to 3 novels bound together with optimism. The engineering teams on the heavy cruiser Caldera had redesigned and rebuilt their own secondary drive systems twice, not because anything was wrong with them, but because there was nothing else to do, and they needed to stay sharp. I had spent the 8 months running simulations. Not combat simulations, though those were part of the rotation. Strategic simulations, diplomatic simulations, economic simulations. I ran scenarios in which the Conclave voted 424 to 0, scenarios in which they voted 212 to 212, and the result was a procedural stalemate. Scenarios in which a single unexpected delegation broke from their government's position and swung enough votes to delay the exile decision by a year or more. I ran scenarios in which the exile vote passed, but the embargo provisions failed separately. I ran scenarios in which everything went exactly as we expected, and scenarios in which nothing did. The one scenario I did not run was the one in which we stayed dark and quiet indefinitely, and the exile never came. I knew what that scenario meant. It meant I had been wrong about what the conclave was, and that Ambassador Osei had been right all along, and that 11 years of patient diplomatic work had actually changed something in the galaxy's fundamental attitude toward humanity. I wanted that scenario to be the true one. I genuinely, sincerely hoped it would be. But I did not run it because hope is not a strategic asset. Hope is what you have when you have done all the planning you can do, and you are waiting for the outcome. You do not plan around hope. You plan around evidence, and the evidence, accumulated over 11 years of conclave proceedings, was not pointing toward that scenario. So I ran the others. I ran them until I had accounted for every variation I could think of in the first 72 hours after a vote, and then I put the simulations aside and went to work on contingency plans for the contingency plans. Then, on a Tuesday, with no drama and no warning beyond the soft alert tone of an incoming priority signal, the message arrived. It came through the quantum relay, a small device in my personal quarters that looked exactly like a calibration tool for navigation equipment, which is what it would show up as in any inventory audit, because that is what the designer had built it to look like. The relay registered an incoming signal. I picked up the device. I read 12 digits. I put the device down. I picked it up and read the digits again. Then I set it back on the shelf carefully, the way you set something down when your hands are not entirely steady, and I stood in my quarters for about 30 seconds, doing nothing except breathing. The message translated to 4 words. 4 words that I had been waiting 8 months to receive, and had not, despite all my preparation, fully accounted for in the moment of actually receiving them. They did it. Begin. I pressed the intercom on my wall. "This is the Admiral," I said. "All ships, all hands. Stand by for active status on my mark. Department heads, I want full readiness reports in 15 minutes. Engineering, begin drive warm-up sequence. Communications, prepare for fleet-wide transmission. This is not a drill. Mark. For exactly 3 seconds, nothing happened. The long quiet held. And then the Rubicon came alive. It started as a sound, a low vibration that I had not heard in 8 months and 4 days. The deep harmonic resonance of the ship's main drives, cycling from cold storage to operational temperature. Then the lights changed, shifting from the dim red of minimum power to the full white of active status. I felt the ship differently under my feet, something almost like a pulse where before there had been nothing. Around me, through the bulkheads and the corridors and the interconnected systems of a ship that was 140,000 tons of human engineering, I could hear the fleet waking up. Not literally. Space does not carry sound in that way. But I knew those ships. I knew their captains and their crew chiefs and their engineers. I knew that at this exact moment, on the Arthur Baines and the Steadfast and the Caldera, and 13 other vessels of varying classification, men and women who had been sitting in the dark for 8 months were doing exactly what I was doing. Standing up straight, taking a breath, getting ready. I went to the bridge. Commander Priya Nair, my executive officer, a precise and exceptionally capable officer who had been with me for 6 years, was already at her station. She looked up when I entered and gave me a nod that contained everything that needed to be said between us. We had talked about this day many times. We had disagreed, at various points, about the likely timing and the probable response from the conclave. We had agreed about the plan. Fleet status? I asked. 17 ships active and reporting. All drives nominal. All weapon systems in standby. Communication arrays coming online now. She paused. We are currently generating a detectable heat signature. Anyone with a sensitive enough scanner within half a light year will know something is out here. How long until we're within scanner range of conclave relay buoys? At current heading, 12 hours. Make it 9. Increase to 1/4 drive. She gave the order without hesitation. I turned to face the view screen at the front of the bridge. It showed open space, the Oort cloud around us, the distant, faint glow of the sun behind us, and ahead, the darkness between our solar system and the nearest Velkari border station. Helm, I said. Set course for Cathara Junction. The helm officer, a young man named Lieutenant Daniel Cho, who had been plotting this exact course in his head for most of the 8 months, entered the coordinates without needing to check anything. Course set, Admiral. All ships acknowledge, I said to communications. 17 acknowledgements came back in sequence, each one a captain's voice confirming that their ship was ready, and their crew was ready, and 8 months of dark and quiet had done nothing to reduce their readiness. If anything, it had sharpened it. There is something about waiting in enforced silence for a very long time that focuses a person. It clarifies what matters and removes the noise around it. I spoke to the fleet on all channels. 17 ships, roughly 11,000 crew members total, listening. 17 months ago, I said, the Galactic Conclave began formal proceedings to determine whether humanity was too dangerous to be allowed freedom of movement in this galaxy. They have now voted. The result is 421 in favor of exile, 3 abstentions, 1 opposed. The exile is official. The embargo begins in 30 days. I let that sit for a moment. I want to be clear about what this means and what it does not mean. It does not mean we have been defeated. It does not mean the situation is permanent. It does not mean that the Conclave's decision has any binding effect on what humanity does next, because the Conclave has never had that power over us, and they have simply chosen, today, to formally acknowledge that they wish they did. What it does mean is that the period of asking nicely is over. We spent 11 years in that chamber with an ambassador who was brilliant and patient, and who believed, as long as believing was a rational position, that conversation could change minds. She did change minds. 3 of them. That matters, and we will remember it. But 421 minds did not change. 421 delegations looked at humanity, at everything we are, everything we have built, everything we have survived, and they decided we were a problem to be managed, rather than a people to be known. I paused. We are going to go introduce ourselves properly. There was no applause on a military bridge. There was not supposed to be. But I felt the change in the room's atmosphere the way you feel a weather shift. Something in the air becoming charged, becoming purposeful. The fleet moved. Not toward the locked hyperspace lanes. That would have been exactly what the Conclave expected. The exile provisions included monitoring stations at every authorized lane entry point, and within the 30-day grace period, those stations would be watching for exactly that kind of exit attempt. We would have been logged, tracked, reported, and the Conclave would have used it as confirmation that Earth was exactly the threat they had said it was. We did not go toward the locked lanes. We went toward the Velkari border, toward Cathara Junction, the single largest communications relay station in the Eastern Galactic Arm, the node through which approximately 60% of all Conclave official transmissions were routed on any given day, the station through which the exile vote itself had been broadcast to the wider galaxy. We went there quietly, at first. 9 hours of travel at 1/4 drive, 9 hours of careful navigation through the space between our solar system and the border, in a region of space that the Conclave's charts classified as empty transit corridor. They classified it as empty because, until 8 months ago, it had been. With the fleet now active and moving, the silence of the long quiet broke around us in gradual stages. People talked in the corridors. The mess hall on the Rubicon had never been loud during the long quiet. People had learned to moderate volume without being asked, the same way you instinctively keep your voice down in a library. And now that instinct went away, replaced by the normal noise of a working ship and a crew that had been holding its breath for most of a year. Owen Gibbs calmed me from the steadfast to report full readiness and to mention, almost as an afterthought, that he had finished the novel. "Is it any good?" I asked. "Honestly, Admiral, I think the middle section drags a little. Send me a copy when this is over." "Yes, ma'am." Commander Nair appeared at my shoulder with a tablet showing an update from the communications team. A signal had been picked up on long-range passive scanners. A Velkari border patrol, one vessel, about 4 hours ahead of us at their current heading, standard patrol route. They were not looking for us specifically. They were not looking for anything in particular. It was a routine border sweep. "Do they have scanner range on us?" I asked. "Not yet. In approximately 6 hours, at our current relative speeds and positions, we will enter the edge of their detection range." "And our current signature?" 17 vessels at 1/4 drive. We are generating heat, electromagnetic output, and drive wake. We are visible to any system calibrated to look for that class of signature." I considered this for a moment. In a standard military context, the response would be clear: evade the patrol, maintain stealth, continue to the objective undetected. That was the instinct, trained into every officer in the fleet. But we were not, at this moment, trying to be invisible. "Hold course," I said. "Match speed. If they detect us, acknowledge their scan. Do not transmit anything until we are within communication range, and then I will speak to their patrol commander directly." Nair raised an eyebrow, just slightly. "You want them to see us coming." "I want the galaxy to know that we came," I said. "There is a difference. We are not hiding. Hiding is something you do when you are afraid of being seen. We are moving in the open, on our own terms, toward a destination we have chosen, because this fleet has every right to be exactly where it is and do exactly what it is going to do." She absorbed this. Then she nodded, the sharp and definite nod of an officer who has understood an order and will carry it out. The fleet moved through the dark at 1/4 drive, generating a clean and unhidden signature that any Velkari scanner would read clearly if it was pointed in the right direction. 9 hours. Crossing the distance between what the galaxy called exile and what the galaxy was about to call something else entirely. I sat in the command chair and drank my coffee. It was the first cup I had made at full heat in 8 months. During the long quiet, even small thermal sources had been kept below detection threshold. Hot coffee, a small thing, unremarkable in any ordinary context. It tasted exactly like the beginning of something. The Velkari border patrol detected us 4 hours and 20 minutes later. I was on the bridge when the alert came from our communications officer. The patrol vessel had swept a scanner in our direction, presumably as part of their routine rotation, and hit a return that was so far outside the parameters of what should be in this region of space that their system flagged it as a potential equipment error before their crew overrode the error classification and looked at it again. The patrol vessel was named, according to the identification transponder it was broadcasting, the Velkari Cooperative Defense Ship Surath Ven. It stopped dead in space about 2 minutes after detecting us, the way a person stops walking when they turn a corner and find something unexpected blocking the entire street. Then it turned and held position, holding position at extreme range, not approaching, not retreating, thinking. I could imagine what was going through the Surath Ven's bridge at that moment. The scanner had returned signatures consistent with 17 military vessels of human classification, traveling at 1/4 drive on a heading toward Cathara Junction, in a region of space that had been certified as empty by the most recent survey. The conclave exile vote had been broadcast 22 hours ago. Humanity was supposed to be under embargo, under containment, under the settled and orderly process of being removed from galactic affairs. Humanity was not supposed to be here, in that number, moving in that direction, looking like that. I opened a communication channel, in Galactic Standard, which I spoke fluently after 15 years of working with the fleet's translation teams. Velkari Patrol Vessel, Surath Ven. This is Fleet Admiral Dominica Vasquez, of the United Earth Naval Command. You have correctly identified our fleet. We are 17 vessels on a course for Cathara Junction. We are not in violation of any agreed boundary. We are traveling in open space on a heading of our own choosing. We do not require your permission to be here, and we are not asking for it. However, I am extending the courtesy of this communication, so that your government is informed of our presence and our direction. Please relay that information to your command authority at your earliest convenience. I paused. We mean you no harm. We are not approaching your vessel. If you choose to shadow us, you are welcome to do so. If you choose to contact your command for guidance, I would encourage you to do it quickly, as we are on a schedule. I closed the channel. Nair was watching me. That was remarkably polite, she said. It is always worth being polite, I said, when you have 17 ships at your back. The Surath Ven did not respond verbally. It began moving, falling in at a careful distance behind the fleet, not following us, exactly, in any tactical sense, but traveling in our direction. Watching, reporting. Within the hour, 3 more Velkari vessels had appeared at the edges of scanner range, drawn by whatever the Surath Ven's report had set in motion. They maintained distance. They did not challenge us. They watched. By the time we reached communication range of Cathara Junction, there were 11 Velkari vessels in loose formation behind us, none of them closer than they had to be, all of them transmitting what I assumed were increasingly alarmed reports to their command structure. Let them watch. Let them report. That was precisely the point. The Cathara Junction station resolved on our view screen over the course of an hour, growing from a distant cluster of lights to a recognizable structure, a great ring of interconnected platforms and docking facilities and relay arrays that processed communications for 60% of the Eastern Galactic Arm. It was one of the most important installations in this region of space, and it was not defended in any meaningful military sense because, in the 400 years since its construction, no one had ever needed to defend it. It was neutral infrastructure. Everyone used it. No one threatened it. I reduced the fleet to minimum drive and brought us to a full stop at a respectful distance from the outer ring. Then I opened a channel to the station. Cathara Junction Station. This is Admiral Vasquez of the United Earth Naval Command. Please advise your station administrator that we have a representative team requesting docking permission for a temporary visit. We require access to Bay 7 on the outer maintenance ring. Duration of visit is estimated at 4 to 6 hours. We come in peace and will leave everything exactly as we find it. There was a long pause from the station. Then, Admiral Vasquez, our records indicate that Earth is currently under a conclave exile provision. Vessels from Earth are not authorized to. We are not in conclave space, I said. Cathara Junction is in the Velkari cooperative jurisdiction, not within the conclave's direct administrative territory. The exile provision applies to conclave hyperspace lanes and conclave trade agreements. It does not apply to our presence in open space or in facilities that operate under cooperative jurisdiction agreements. Another pause, a longer one. This was, I knew, absolutely correct. I had read the exile provisions in exhaustive detail. I had read them multiple times. I had had 3 different legal teams read them. The conclave had been very thorough about restricting our access to their specific infrastructure. They had been significantly less thorough about the legal question of what we could do in space that was not directly theirs. That was a mistake that took about 15 years of close attention to the structure of galactic law to identify. We had identified it a very long time ago. "Stand by," the station said. We stood by. I turned to Nair. "Get Commander Gibbs's ground team prepped. Base 7. 12 personnel. Tools only. No weapons beyond personal sidearms. They go in polite, and they come out polite. And nothing in that station gets damaged or disrupted." Nair relayed the order. The ground team we were sending was led by Commander Elon Sharp, one of the finest tactical officers in the fleet, who had been chosen for this specific task not because of his combat record, which was excellent, but because of a characteristic he had demonstrated throughout his career that was rarer than tactical excellence. He knew exactly when not to act. While we waited for the station's response, I thought about what the next few hours would look like from the outside. 11 Valkyrie patrol vessels holding position behind a human fleet. A communications relay station in the middle of a request. It had no precedent for processing. Every long-range scanner in the eastern arm now pointed in our direction, because patrol vessels generate their own signals, and those signals had been going out for hours. The galaxy was watching. That was what mattered. Not what we did at Cathara Junction specifically, but the fact that we were doing it in plain sight, in open space, with 17 ships, and no apology, and no request for permission from anyone who did not have the actual legal authority to grant or deny it. The station granted docking access to Bay 7 14 minutes later. Their administrator, I would learn afterward, had spent most of that 14 minutes in rapid communication with both Valkyrie Cooperative Command and a Conclave liaison officer who was stationed permanently at the junction. The liaison officer had apparently been unable to identify a specific legal provision that prohibited what we were doing. The Cooperative Command had told the administrator to grant access and keep detailed records of everything. Good. Records were exactly what we wanted them to keep. Elon Sharp and his team docked at Bay 7. I watched the feed from their body cameras on the secondary screen on my bridge. The Cathara Junction station was about to receive a very politely delivered piece of information that its administrators were not going to enjoy. And the 11 Valkyrie patrol vessels behind us, and every scanner pointed our way, were going to see that humanity had arrived. Not with a negotiating position, not with a request, not with the careful and apologetic posture of a species asking to be accepted. With a bill, E. The station administrator had 8 legs and 3 brains, and right now, all 3 of those brains were working at full capacity and still not keeping up. My name is Elon Sharp. I am a commander in the United Earth Naval Command, and I have led difficult operations in difficult places under difficult circumstances. But I want to be honest about something. Walking through the maintenance corridors of Cathara Junction with 12 people and a data chip was one of the stranger assignments I had ever received. Not the most dangerous, not the most complicated, but strange in a way that required a specific kind of self-control, because the temptation throughout the whole operation was to laugh, and laughing would have entirely undermined the point. The point was to be completely serious, completely professional, unremarkable in every detail of our behavior, except for the single, enormous, galaxy-shaking thing that we were actually doing. We came through Bay 7's maintenance access without incident. The station's security team had met us at the docking collar, 6 Valkyrie guards in uniform, heavily armed, very rigid in their posture, watching us with the focused attention of people who have been told something is probably fine, but have also been told to watch very carefully. I shook hands with their supervisor. I thanked them for the smooth docking process. I mentioned that we would not take more than 4 hours of the station's time, and that we had no intention of disrupting any of the station's operations. The supervisor was a Valkyrie named Death Carr, who had 8 arms arranged in 4 pairs and a face that was, I had learned from years of diplomatic training, currently expressing the equivalent of profound professional discomfort. She acknowledged my remarks. She assigned 2 of her guards to accompany my team. I thanked her for that as well. Then we walked, the 14 of us in a group, through the maintenance corridors of the most important communications hub in the eastern arm of the galaxy, and my team was absolutely silent, absolutely professional, and every single one of them was maintaining the careful neutral expression that I had specifically instructed them to maintain. We reached the relay control center in 11 minutes. The center was a large room with banks of processing equipment along every wall, and a central console that managed the routing of communications through 47 relay arrays simultaneously. It was staffed by 9 technicians of 3 different species, and when we came through the door, all 9 of them stopped what they were doing and looked at us. I raised a hand in greeting. "We apologize for the interruption," I said in Galactic Standard. "Please continue your work. We will need about 15 minutes of your supervisor's time." The technicians looked at Death Car's guards. The guards looked at each other. Nobody moved. "We are not shutting anything down," I said pleasantly. "We are not damaging anything. We are going to speak with whoever is responsible for this facility's administrative records, deliver a document, and leave. If your supervisor would like to join us, that would be helpful. If not, we can wait." Administrator Su Teth appeared 6 minutes later. He came through a side door with the rapid, slightly uneven movement of a being who had been in the middle of something urgent when summoned. He was a large Velkari, the largest I had ever seen in person, and his iridescent scales were cycling through colors in rapid sequence, which in Velkari physiology indicated the simultaneous operation of all 3 cognitive centers at elevated processing speed. All 3 of his brains were fully engaged. He looked at my team, then at the guards, then at me. "Commander Sharp," he said. His voice was translated by the station's system in real time, the Galactic Standard equivalent of his native pressure speech, arriving with only a slight delay. "I am told you have a document for me." "We do," I said. I held out the data chip. It was a standard conclave format information chip, silver and about the size of a human thumbnail, unremarkable in appearance. The kind of thing that got passed between administrators hundreds of times every day in this station. He took it carefully, the way you take something when you are not entirely sure what it will do. "What is this?" he asked. "A bill," I said. The 3 brains showed in his expression simultaneously, one processing the word, one processing the context, one apparently refusing to believe either of the other 2. "A bill," he repeated. "An invoice," I said. "A formal accounting." Humanity has been using Velkari-maintained hyperspace relay corridors for 17 years. The Velkari Cooperative Infrastructure Maintenance Fee Schedule, which is part of the public record of the Galactic Trade Framework, specifies a per-transit charge for commercial and governmental use of those corridors. Earth was never invoiced. We assume this was an administrative oversight. We have calculated the outstanding balance. He was staring at the data chip in his hand. "The number on that chip," I continued, "represents 17 years of back-calculated transit fees at the rates your own cooperative set. We are not demanding immediate payment. We are not threatening any consequences for non-payment. We are simply entering the calculation into the formal record, so that the record reflects the actual financial relationship between Earth and the Velkari Cooperative accurately." Su Teth looked up from the chip. His scales had gone entirely flat, which I had learned during my briefing prep meant something close to stunned suspension of normal cognitive function. "You cannot be serious," he said. "The math is extremely serious," I said. "We had 17 different teams verify it independently. If there are any errors, we are very willing to discuss corrections. Though I should mention that our initial calculation was conservative. There are several categories of transit that we left out of the first draft because the applicable fee schedule was ambiguous." He put the chip down on the console in front of him very carefully, as if it had weight he had not anticipated. "This number is," he began. "Large," I agreed. "Yes. That is what 17 years of uncompensated infrastructure use looks like when you add it up." We found that very instructive as well. Death Car's guards had moved, very slightly, closer together. Not a threatening movement, more like the instinctive clustering of beings who want to be near other beings when reality is doing something unexpected. "We are not collecting this debt," I said. "I want to be completely clear about that. We are making a point. The Galactic Conclave voted to exile humanity. Before that exile takes formal effect, we wanted the record to reflect something that the exile decision did not account for, which is that humanity is not simply a nuisance to be removed. We have been a participant in the galactic economy for 17 years. We have used infrastructure, contributed to systems, entered into relationships, and yes, accumulated obligations of our own. But obligations run in both directions, Administrator. That chip represents one direction. There are others. Suteth was quiet for a long moment. His scales had begun cycling again, but more slowly now, the settled cycling of deep thought rather than rapid emergency processing. "What do you want?" he asked at last. "Nothing," I said. "From you, right now. Nothing except acknowledgement that you have received the document. That is all. We will be leaving shortly, and the station will return to normal operations, and nobody here will have been harmed or inconvenienced in any significant way." "And the fleet outside?" "The fleet is outside because we are in it," I said. "We needed to get here. We came in ships. Those ships will depart with us when we leave." He looked at me for a long time, with an expression that his species' face could not fully translate into human-readable terms, but which contained, I believed, a mixture of things. Confusion, reluctant calculation, something that might have been, at its edges, the earliest possible stage of a very different kind of respect. "You brought 17 warships to deliver a bill," he said. "We brought 17 ships," I said. "They are warships in the sense that they are naval vessels and their crews are military personnel. Whether they are warships in the sense that matters to you right now depends entirely on what happens next. So far, nothing has happened except a document delivery." He picked up the chip again, turned it over in one of his hands. "The conclave is going to hear about this within the hour," he said. "That is the idea," I said. I signaled my team. We began the walk back toward Base 7, with Death Car's guards flanking us in the same formation they had maintained throughout the visit. The technicians in the relay center had returned to their consoles, though I noticed that several of them were doing so with the slightly abstracted attention of people who are working, while also thinking very hard about something else. We passed back through the maintenance corridor, the same panels, the same filtered air, the same carefully maintained infrastructure that carried the communications of 600 civilizations across the most complex relay network in this arm of the galaxy. I thought about what the next hour would look like from Suteth's perspective. He would transmit a report to Velkari Cooperative Command. That report would go through the relay arrays we had just visited. It would be routed through the same infrastructure whose back-calculated usage fees were now sitting in a data chip on his console. And it would arrive at Cooperative Command along with reports from 11 patrol vessels and whatever independent scanning systems the various powers in this region had been running in the last few hours. All of those reports would say the same thing, more or less. A human fleet arrived. They were polite, they asked permission to dock, they delivered a document. They left everything exactly as they found it. They caused no damage, they threatened no one, and they created a situation that had no precedent in 400 years of galactic law. Because nobody had ever done this before. Nobody had ever arrived at the most important communications hub in the Eastern Arm with 17 ships. Not to threaten it, not to take it, not to shut it down, but to deliver paperwork. The Conclave had spent 17 years treating humanity like a problem to be managed, a contained and limited threat, something to be regulated and gradually pressured into compliance. They had not been watching us build. They had not been watching us plan. They had not been watching us read every line of galactic law with the patient attention of a species that had spent thousands of years learning to use the tools of whoever was currently in power. They thought they knew what we were. Back in Base 7, my team boarded our shuttle in good order. Death Car's guards waited at the docking collar until the airlock sealed. I heard the soft hiss of pressurization and the mechanical clunk of the docking collar releasing. Then we were away from the station, rising through its outer ring and back into open space, and ahead of us, the Rubicon and 16 other ships were waiting exactly where we had left them. I opened a channel to the bridge. "Document delivered," I said. "No incidents. Station is fully operational. Administrator has confirmed receipt." Admiral Vasquez's voice came back immediately. "Understood. Begin withdrawal. We have 14 more stops on the schedule." 14 more stops. I had known about the 14, of course. I had read the operation plan in detail. But hearing it said aloud, with Cathara Junction already behind us, and the data chip sitting in a Velkari administrator's hand, and 11 patrol vessels watching our every move, the scale of what we were doing in the next 72 hours became a different kind of real. 14 more stations. 14 more administrators. 14 more data chips, each one tailored to the specific infrastructure relationship between Earth and that facility's controlling power. Some of them were Velkari, some were Thun. Two were run under joint conclave administration. One, at the outer edge of our operational range, was operated by the Pale Communion of Vesh. Every single one of them was going to receive, from a team as polite and professional as ours, a document that the conclave had never thought to account for in their exile provisions. Because they had spent 17 years treating us like a problem, and problems don't keep records. Problems don't read the fine print. Problems don't spend 15 years carefully identifying every financial, legal, and infrastructural obligation that the galaxy has accumulated toward them, and then wait, patiently and quietly, for the moment when presenting that accounting would be most precisely felt. People do that. Civilizations do that. And humanity, whatever the conclave had voted us to be, was both. The shuttle climbed away from the station, and behind us, the Cathara Junction relay arrays continued transmitting the communications of 600 civilizations in every direction, as they had done for 400 years, and would do for 400 more. Including, in that exact moment, a very detailed report about what had just happened in Bay 7, which was traveling outward at the speed of light toward every major government and media outlet in the Eastern Galactic Arm. We had delivered one document. The document was going to deliver itself to everyone else. Back aboard the Rubicon, I wrote my mission report in the kind of clean and factual language that military reports require. Time of entry, duration of visit, disposition of station personnel, condition of all equipment on departure, no deviations from the operation plan, no use of force, no injuries to any personnel of any species. The report was accurate and complete, and said very little about the actual significance of what we had done. Military reports are like that. They describe the surface, and trust that the people reading them understand the depth. Admiral Vasquez read it in under 3 minutes, and then called me to her bridge for a debrief. She was standing at the main view screen when I arrived, watching the fleet's sensor display. The 11 Velkari patrol vessels were still in loose formation behind us, maintaining the same respectful distance they had kept since they first detected us. They had been joined by a 12th vessel in the last hour, a heavier craft, probably a command ship sent out to observe and report at higher authority level. "They're watching very carefully," she said when I came to stand beside her. "They don't know what to do with us," I said. She turned to look at me. "How did the administrator take it?" "About the way you'd expect," I said. 3 simultaneous processing systems, all confused in different ways. He asked what we wanted. I told him nothing, except acknowledgement of receipt. She made a sound that was almost a laugh. "What did he say to that?" "He said you brought 17 warships to deliver a bill." This time she actually laughed. It was brief and quiet, but it was real. "What did you say?" "I said they were ships in the naval sense, and whether they were warships in the way he meant depended on what happened next." She nodded. "Good answer." She turned back to the screen. "The conclave liaison at the junction has already transmitted to the High Arbiter's office. I'm reading secondary signals from 6 different conclave monitoring stations in the sector, all of which changed their scan patterns about 40 minutes ago. They're looking at us." "Good." "The second phase teams are in position. All 14 stations are ready for simultaneous approach. We synchronize in 3 hours." 3 hours. 14 stations across a wide arc of the Eastern Galactic Arm, each one receiving a human visit team at roughly the same moment. Not identical operations. Each team had been briefed on the specific infrastructure relationship and legal framework for their target, but the same basic structure. Documents delivered, records created, everything left intact and operational. 3 hours. And then whatever the Galactic Conclave had thought it was doing with its exile vote was going to look very different from the outside. I thought about the administrator at Cathara Junction, sitting with that data chip, trying to decide what to report first and to whom. I thought about 12 more administrators across the arm who were about to have the same problem. I thought about the conclave legal offices, which were about to receive simultaneous queries from a dozen different jurisdictions, all of them asking the same basic question: is this legal? The answer, as our legal teams had confirmed exhaustively, was yes. Entirely, completely, and frustratingly yes. We had not violated a single provision of the exile decree. We had not crossed a conclave hyperspace lane without authorization. We had not engaged in embargoed trade. We had not done anything that the exile provisions explicitly prohibited. We had simply done things that the exile provisions had not thought to prohibit, because the people who wrote those provisions had been thinking about containing us. They had not been thinking about what we would do if we decided that containment was not a request we were going to honor. There is a difference between a wall and a lock. A wall stops everything. A lock stops what it was designed to stop, and nothing else. The exile provisions were a very elaborate lock. We had spent 15 years finding the doors. I filed my mission report, ate a meal in the officer's mess for the first time in what felt like a different life, and reported back to the bridge 3 hours later, exactly on time. The fleet was ready. All 14 simultaneous approach operations launched in sequence, coordinated across a stretch of space wide enough that the light speed delay between the farthest points created a 2-hour window during which reports were still arriving as others were completing. By the end of those 2 hours, 14 stations across the Eastern Galactic Arm had received a visit from a polite and professional human team. 14 administrators had accepted a data chip and confirmed receipt of a document. 14 stations had returned to normal operations within the promised time window, and the Galactic Conclave's communication channels were carrying more traffic than they had seen since the day of the exile vote itself, because every government with assets anywhere near those 14 stations had simultaneously received something that required an urgent and thorough response. Admiral Vasquez watched all of it from the bridge of the Rubicon. She did not look triumphant. She did not look satisfied in the way that someone looks when they have won a contest. She looked focused, the way a person looks when a plan is unfolding exactly as expected, and they are tracking it carefully to make sure nothing deviates. I stood beside her for the last hour of the operation, watching the reports come in one by one. All 14, document delivered, no incidents, station operational, acknowledgement confirmed. When the last report arrived, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Get the fleet back to assembly position. We've got the next phase to prepare for." "What's the next phase?" I asked. "The Conclave is going to respond," she said. "They always respond. The question is how, and based on how, we'll know what comes after that." She turned to look at me directly for the first time since the debrief. "You did good work today, Commander. Your team did good work. That's a difficult operation to run with the restraint it required, and you ran it exactly right. Thank you, Admiral. Get some rest. 12 hours if you can manage it. I have a feeling the next 72 are going to be busy." I went to my quarters, and I lay down on my bunk, and I looked at the ceiling, and I thought about all the administrators across the arm who were looking at data chips and writing reports and trying to find a legal framework to put what had happened into. They would not find one. Not a clean one. Not one that resolved neatly. Because what had happened was not a provocation in the legal sense. It was not an act of aggression in any definition the Conclave statutes recognized. It was not a violation of the exile decree or any other formal provision. It was something simpler and, in some ways, much harder to deal with. It was humanity insisting on being counted, not accepted, not forgiven, not welcomed back, just counted, measured, placed accurately in the record of what the galaxy owed and was owed in return. 421 species had voted to make us invisible. 14 data chips, delivered politely in 2 hours of coordinated operation, had said very clearly and very precisely that visible was exactly what we intended to remain. I closed my eyes. Somewhere outside the hull, the fleet was realigning. Beyond the fleet, 12 Velkari patrol vessels were transmitting reports. Beyond them, the relay stations were carrying information in all directions at the speed of light. And in the conclave chamber, and in government offices across the Eastern Arm, people of a great many species were reading those reports and realizing, perhaps for the first time since the vote, that exile had not simplified the situation. It had complicated it, enormously, in ways they had not anticipated. That was, from my perspective, roughly the best possible outcome of a mission that had involved 17 ships, 12 personnel, and a data chip. I slept. The face the galaxy saw that morning was mine. My name is Yara Ose, 11 years as Earth's ambassador to the Galactic Conclave. 11 years of careful words and measured tones, and the exhausting discipline of presenting humanity, in the most palatable form I could manage, while still being honest about what humanity actually was. 11 years of shrinking. I was done shrinking. The broadcast originated from a location I am not going to specify, routed through a relay system that the Conclave's Communications Monitoring Office spent the better part of a week trying to trace, and never fully succeeded. It went out simultaneously on 7 different Conclave standard frequencies, which meant it was received by every vessel, station, and inhabited body within reception range of those frequencies at the same time. That range covered approximately 60% of the known inhabited galaxy. I sat in front of a camera in a small room with a neutral background, wearing a plain dark jacket, and I looked into the lens with the same steady attention I had given to 423 delegations across 11 years of conclave sessions. And I spoke. My name is Yara Osei. I was Earth's voice in the Galactic Conclave. The Conclave has decided it no longer wants to hear that voice. That is the Conclave's right, and I am not here to argue with the outcome of the vote. I am here to enter something into the formal record before the exile becomes the story everyone tells. What I am entering is not a negotiating position. It is not a request. It is a statement of fact about who and what humanity is, delivered directly to everyone listening, rather than through the filtered and managed channel of a conclave session, where I am allowed only to observe and submit written responses. These are the laws of humanity, not laws in the legislative sense, not rules we are asking the galaxy to follow. Laws in the sense of observable, consistent, documented patterns in how our species behaves when the conditions that trigger those patterns are met. We are sharing them because the galaxy has repeatedly demonstrated that it does not understand us, and misunderstanding us at this moment in history has consequences that we believe no one in this part of the galaxy actually wants to experience. I looked at the camera. The first law. If you harm a human being, humanity will come for you. Not your government, not your fleet command, not the specific individual who gave the order. Humanity will come for you. The full weight of a species that has been carrying grudges across ice ages, that built its first cities partly for the purpose of organizing effective responses to threats, that has never in recorded history simply accepted harm to its people without response. This is not a threat we are making. This is a description of what we are. We are telling you so that you are not surprised later. I kept my voice level. No anger in it. No emotion of any kind that a listener could mistake for performance. The second law. We trade in good faith, or we do not trade. We have spent the last 72 hours delivering formal accounting documents to 14 relay stations across the Eastern Galactic Arm. Those documents represent 17 years of back-calculated infrastructure fees that Earth was never invoiced for. We are not collecting those debts. We are establishing that the debts exist. Every trade agreement, every infrastructure arrangement, every economic relationship between Earth and any conclave member species is now under formal review. Any relationship found to have included terms that were materially unfavorable to Earth through deliberate misrepresentation will be brought to the attention of the relevant parties with a proposed correction. Acceptance of the correction is not required, but refusal will be noted, and we have very good notes. The third law. We do not require your permission to survive. We have mapped hyperspace routes that do not use conclave-controlled infrastructure. We have reverse-engineered or independently developed functional equivalents of every major technology class the conclave holds under licensing restrictions. We have established supply chains for every critical material category that do not pass through embargoed territory. We began this work 17 years ago. In the same year we first submitted membership application to the conclave, because we had read the membership agreement carefully, and we had made an assessment about what the long-term trajectory of that agreement was likely to be. We were correct in our assessment. We are not surprised by the exile vote. We prepared for it. I paused, just briefly. We prepared for it, while simultaneously doing everything in our power to make it unnecessary. These two things are not contradictory. They are rational. They are what any species with a history like ours does when it reaches the stars and finds that the stars are organized in a way it does not fully control. The fourth law is different from the others. The fourth law is not about what we do when we are threatened or harmed or treated unfairly. It is about what we do when something else happens. The fourth law is that we remember kindness. My voice was quieter here, deliberately. Not because I was less certain about this law than the others, but because it was the most important one, and importance does not require volume. There were 3 abstentions in the vote that exiled us. 3 delegations who looked at 421 votes in one direction and did not go with them. One of those delegations broke with its own government's official position, at significant personal cost to the individual who cast that vote. We know who they are. We will remember them, specifically and individually, in everything that comes next. We will remember every small act of fairness in 17 years of conclave proceedings. We will remember every trade partner who dealt with us honestly. We will remember every species that treated us as what we are, rather than what they feared we might be. Memory is the most human thing about us. We remember everything, the harm and the kindness both, in equally precise detail, for longer than you might expect. The exile stands if the conclave wishes it. We are not asking for reconsideration. We are not petitioning for reinstatement. We are informing the galaxy that exile has not removed humanity from the galactic stage. It has removed our obligation to perform on that stage the way the conclave preferred. We will continue to be in this galaxy. We will continue to act according to our own nature and our own values. We will continue to expand, to build, to trade, to explore, and to maintain relationships with anyone who wishes to maintain them with us. We will do all of this without asking the conclave's permission, because we have reviewed the relevant statutes carefully, and the conclave does not in fact have the legal authority to require that permission in open space or in non-conclave jurisdictions. We were very thorough in our review. We recommend that conclave legal offices review the same materials before drafting any response. To any species currently listening who is weighing a decision about how to relate to humanity going forward, we offer this summary. We are fair, we are patient, we keep our word, we remember both debts and gifts, and we do not accept permanent exclusion from spaces we have every right to occupy. These things are true simultaneously, without contradiction, because they are all part of the same answer to the same question. The question is, what are humans? We are the species that survived. Everything else follows from that. I looked at the camera for one more moment. Then I said, this concludes the formal record of Earth's response to the exile decision. Thank you for listening. The broadcast ended. In the room where I had recorded it, Colin Hart was sitting in a chair, with a tablet in his lap, and an expression on his face that I could not immediately classify. He had watched the recording in real time. He had not moved or made a sound through the whole of it. Ambassador, he said. Former ambassador, I said. I resigned the post 3 days ago. Yes, but... He stopped, tried again. Was that scripted? Did you write all of that out in advance? The laws were scripted, I said. The rest I'd thought about for a long time. The 4th one, he said, about remembering kindness. Yes? He was quiet for a moment. I thought the first 3 were the ones that mattered. From a strategic standpoint, I thought the 4th one was... He seemed to be searching for the word. Softer? I said. I was going to say unexpected. I sat down across from him. The first 3 laws describe what we do when things go wrong. They are necessary and they are true, and any species that pays attention to them should take them seriously. But a species that only has those 3 laws, a species that is only capable of remembering harm and responding to harm and protecting itself from harm, that species is something the galaxy should reasonably be afraid of. He nodded slowly. The 4th law is what makes the first 3 bearable, for us and for everyone else. We remember kindness with the same precision and permanence that we remember harm. That means the path toward us is as clear as the path away from us. It means we are not simply a threat to be managed. We are a relationship to be had. Do you think they understood that? He asked. The ones listening? I thought about 423 delegations in a crystal-domed chamber. I thought about 11 years of trying to make them understand something that I had sometimes struggled to fully articulate myself. Some of them, I said, the ones who were already trying to. The others will need more time. My comm unit buzzed. It was a signal from the relay network, not a message exactly, but a data indicator showing retransmission counts for the broadcast. Within 3 hours of its initial release, 37 independent alien media networks had retransmitted it in full or in significant part. The Pale Communion of Vesh had broadcasted across their entire internal information network. 2 smaller species, ones with no direct stake in the conclave's decision either way, had transmitted it to their populations as breaking news. Nobody had asked our permission. Nobody had coordinated with us. They had simply decided, each of them individually, that this was something their people needed to hear. I looked at the retransmission count for a long time. Then I said, "Colin, I need you to draft communication requests to 37 independent networks." "What kind of communication requests?" "Thank you notes," I said. "Genuine ones, not political documents, not strategic outreach, just thanks, from one communicator to another, for choosing to pass something along that they felt mattered." He looked at me. "Is that part of the plan?" "No," I said. "It's part of the fourth law." He picked up his tablet without another word and began to draft. Outside, on every frequency that carried the conclave's official communications, the responses were already beginning to come in. Governments issuing statements, conclave legal offices preparing formal positions, trade bodies requesting clarification, media outlets debating the implications. The galaxy, in its vast and complicated way, was processing something it had not expected and did not quite have the language for. That was fine. We had time. Humans are very good at waiting for the right moment to speak again. We had been doing it for a very long time, in very difficult circumstances, and we had never stopped having things worth saying. The broadcast had gone out. The laws were in the record now. The galaxy could ignore them, argue with them, fear them, or choose to understand them. What the galaxy could not do was pretend it had not heard them. That was enough, for now. More than enough. The real work was just beginning. The thank you notes went out within the hour, 37 of them, one for each network that had retransmitted the broadcast. Colin wrote them well, straightforward, specific about what we were thanking each network for, personal without being performative. He signed them from me, as requested, though he had done the actual writing. In the 3 hours after the broadcast ended, while the retransmission count climbed and the conclave response channels filled with activity, I received something I had not expected. A private message from one of the 37 networks. It was from a small independent outlet based out of the Areth-San border territories, operated by a journalist whose name translated approximately as the one who asks the uncomfortable question. They had been broadcasting human-related news to their local audience for 6 years, mostly without any direct contact with Earth's diplomatic mission. They had covered the exile vote the day before with what their translator described as careful sadness. The message was short. We retransmitted because it was true. Not all of it was easy to hear. Some of it frightened our editorial team. We retransmitted anyway, because the things that frighten us are exactly the things we should be reporting on. Thank you for making a statement that was honest enough to be frightening. Those are the only statements that are actually useful. I read it twice. Then I wrote back personally, not through Colin. And what I wrote was longer than a thank you note, and shorter than a diplomatic message, and exactly what I meant. I said that honest communication was the hardest kind, that I had spent 11 years in a chamber where honesty was managed and measured and permitted only within carefully constructed limits, and that I was genuinely uncertain, even now, whether I had gotten the balance right in the broadcast. I said that the fourth law was the one I believed in most deeply, and that receiving their message was a small demonstration of exactly why. I said that if they ever wanted to speak further, I would make time. They wrote back 4 minutes later. They wanted to speak further. That conversation lasted 2 hours and produced, eventually, the first interview any independent, non-human media outlet had ever conducted, directly with a senior Earth government figure, without a conclave diplomatic framework intermediating the exchange. It would not be published for another month. When it was published, it was retransmitted by 416 independent outlets across the known galaxy. Not 37, 416. But that was later. In the immediate hours after the broadcast, the picture was more complicated. The conclave's official response arrived through the standard diplomatic channels. A formal communiqué addressed to the government of Earth, routed through the emergency contact protocol that existed for use after a diplomatic mission had concluded. It was addressed to my former office in Geneva, rather than to me personally, which was technically correct given that I had resigned. Colin, still technically my assistant until the mission was formally closed, forwarded it to me. The communiqué was 17 pages of carefully constructed galactic standard. I read all of it. Then I read the summary of it that the Geneva office had prepared. Then I read the original again. The conclave was not rescinding the exile. That had never been likely. What the conclave was doing, and this was more interesting, was requesting a formal clarification meeting. Not a reinstatement discussion, not an appeal hearing, a clarification meeting, which in conclave legal terminology meant a session intended to establish shared understanding of the boundaries of existing agreements without prejudicing the underlying legal positions of either party. In plain terms, they wanted to talk without either side having to admit they wanted to talk. I flagged the communiqué with a single word in my notes. Noted. Then I forwarded it to the 4 people in Geneva who were handling Earth's formal response posture, and went back to the conversation with the Erith San journalist. The clarification meeting could wait. The conclave was going to request it again, possibly multiple times. When we responded, we would do so on our own timeline, in a way that made clear we were responding because we chose to, and not because we had been pressured into it. That distinction mattered more than it might seem. The exile had been about control. It had been about the conclave establishing, formally and on the record, that it had the power to determine humanity's place in the galaxy. The exile decree was less about actually removing us from anything, and more about demonstrating that the conclave had the authority to remove us if it chose to. Our response was about the same thing, from the other direction. Every operation in the last 72 hours, the fleet's open movement through non-conclave space, the document deliveries, the broadcast, had been about demonstrating, formally and on the record, that the conclave's determination of our place in the galaxy was one opinion among several, and that the other opinions included ours, which carried somewhat more weight with us. The clarification meeting could happen, eventually, on terms that reflected this reality clearly. Until then, we had 14 more operational phases planned, a fleet in position, and 37 media relationships that were becoming 416. And somewhere in the galaxy, 3 delegations who had abstained were watching all of this and making their own calculations. I thought about them often in those hours, about what it cost someone to abstain when 421 others had made a different choice, about what kind of calculation led a Velkari council member to break with her own government on a vote of this magnitude, about what we owed them in return for that cost. Law 4. We remember kindness. We remember it specifically. Not as a general principle, not as an abstract commitment. We remember the specific person who paid a specific cost to do a specific good thing, and we carry that memory the same way we carry everything, permanently, precisely, with the full weight of a species that has been keeping accounts since before we had writing to keep them in. 3 abstentions. It was not enough to change a vote. But it was enough to change a relationship, and relationships, built carefully over time between honest parties, are the thing that actually holds civilizations together when the votes have all been counted, and the decrees have been issued, and the real work of living alongside each other still has to be done. I knew that. I had always known it. It was why I had spent 11 years in that chamber, when a less patient person would have left much sooner. And it was why, even now, after everything, the thing I cared most about was not the fleet's position, or the conclave's response, or the operational phases still to come. It was the 3 names in my journal, and what we were going to do about them. On day 9, after the exile vote, the Thuan made their move. My name is Dominica Vasquez, and I had been expecting them to do something since approximately day 3. The Thun Cooperative controlled 3 of the 6 hyperspace choke points that any alternate route out of our solar system would need to navigate through, which meant they had leverage that most of the other conclave members did not have, and the Thun were exactly the kind of species that used leverage the moment they identified it. I had run 17 different simulations of what their response might look like. The simulation that came closest to what actually happened was number 14, which I had labeled Direct Demonstration of Force at Symbolic Target. They sent 40 vessels to blockade Earth's moon. Not Earth itself, the moon, Luna, which has been inhabited since the 22nd century by approximately 2 million people, mostly in research stations and industrial facilities, and the 3 permanent settlements that had grown up around the early landing sites over the course of 150 years. The moon is not a significant military asset. It is not a strategic choke point. It is not particularly important to Earth's broader defense posture. It is visible from Earth's surface with the naked eye. That was the point. 40 Thun vessels hanging in visible formation around humanity's oldest neighbor was not a military maneuver. It was theater. It was a statement, broadcast to every scanner in the system and beyond, designed to say, the exile is real, the embargo has teeth, and humanity should understand its position. I read the Thun command's accompanying statement twice. It was better written than I expected, which told me someone in their diplomatic corps had worked on it. The key line was, "Those who feel our presence is a negotiation have miscounted our ships." Good line. Genuinely. I made a note of it in my strategic log. Then I called Commander Nair over. "They have 40 vessels at the moon," I said. "What do we have in the outer system currently?" "The full fleet, minus the 3 detachment groups from the station operations. 14 ships on our immediate position. Callaway's group of 3 positioned near the Jovian belt, per the contingency plan." "Where is Callaway right now?" "Currently dark, holding position at Europa. They have not received any contact from Thun units." Good. I thought for a moment. What is the Thun home system's primary fuel dependency? Nair brought up the relevant data on the secondary screen. The Thun cooperative was an organic civilization. Their biology was carbon-based, but with a metabolic chemistry that required specific atmospheric compounds for the biomass colonies that made up their population. Those compounds were produced naturally in the atmospheres of gas giants, and the Thun had, over the centuries, developed an economy deeply dependent on atmospheric harvesting from 3 specific gas giants in their home system. Without that harvesting, the Thun cooperative's industrial output dropped to roughly 20% of normal capacity within 4 months. Without it for a year, significant portions of their population faced biological stress. I looked at the position of Callaway's group of 3 ships near Europa. "Get me a course plot," I said, "from Callaway's current position to the Thun home system, specifically to the orbital space around their primary atmospheric harvesting planet." Nair raised both eyebrows slightly. She did not say anything, which meant she understood exactly what I was thinking, and was waiting to hear how I was going to say it. "We are not going to touch anything," I said. "We are not going to threaten anything. We are going to park 1 destroyer in orbital space, above a Thun gas giant, and open a communication channel." "And say what, Admiral?" "The truth," I said. "Exactly the truth, and nothing more than the truth." She gave the order to plot the course. While the navigation team worked, I drafted the message myself, which was something I did rarely. Usually communication with external parties went through the fleet's diplomatic liaison team, who were better at the specific language requirements than I was. This message did not require diplomatic language. It required military language, spoken with the precision of someone who knows exactly how much they do and do not need to say. Callaway's group made the transit in 11 hours. Commander Helena Callaway, a decade of experience, exactly the right disposition for an operation like this, acknowledged the orders and the course, without asking any questions, which meant she understood the objective. Her 3 ships transitioned to 1/4 drive and made for the Thun home system by a route that avoided every conclave monitoring station and every major shipping lane. Dark running until the final approach. Then active, visible, fully transmitting. She parked the lead destroyer in stable orbit above the second of the 3 gas giants, the largest harvesting operation, the one that supplied about 40% of the cooperative's total atmospheric compound production. She held position there for 20 minutes without transmitting anything, just being visible to every scanner in the system. Then she opened a channel to the Thun Cooperative's Central Command Authority. I had listened to the recording of that communication at least a dozen times in the months since. Callaway's voice was level throughout, completely without aggression, without tension, without any emotional content that could be read as threatening. She was stating facts, in the same tone you use to tell someone the weather. Thun Cooperative Command. This is Commander Helena Callaway, of the United Earth Naval Command Destroyer Group, currently in orbital position, above your primary atmospheric harvesting operation. Your fleet has established a blockade formation around Earth's moon. We have noted this. We have not responded to it with matching force, because we do not believe that matching force is the most informative response we can provide. We are here, at your primary fuel source, because we want the cooperative's command to have complete information about the current strategic situation before making any further decisions. We have not damaged anything. We have not threatened anything. We have not attempted to interfere with any harvesting operations. We are simply present, in orbital space, adjacent to infrastructure that is significant to your civilization's economic function. A pause. Measured. Deliberate. We understand that the cooperative believes the exile vote has placed humanity in a position of disadvantage. We want to ensure that this understanding is accurate. Earth is not in a position of disadvantage. Earth is in a position of having very little left to lose from an escalation, which is a meaningfully different position, and one that the cooperative should factor carefully into its planning. Another pause. We have no intention of damaging your harvesting facilities. We have no intention of harming your population. We do not operate that way, and we do not want to. And we are telling you this directly and honestly, because we believe you should know the difference between what we are and what you might currently be afraid we are. We are, however, prepared to remain in this position for as long as it takes for the cooperative's command to reach a conclusion about whether the blockade of Earth's moon is serving the purpose it was sent to serve. We have significant fuel reserves. We are patient people. We once crossed a land bridge on foot to populate an entire planet. We are comfortable waiting. We look forward to your response. She closed the channel. The Thun blockade began withdrawing from Earth's moon, 11 hours later. 40 vessels in a measured and orderly withdrawal that took approximately 3 hours to complete. They did not issue any public statement accompanying the withdrawal. They did not acknowledge Callaway's transmission publicly. They simply left. I received the report from Earth's monitoring systems at 0300 and read it in my quarters over a cup of coffee that had gone slightly cold. 40 ships. No shots. No threats carried out. No damage. No injuries. Nothing except presence, in the right place, stated with precision and without excess. The conclave monitoring stations in the region had recorded everything. The withdrawal was a matter of public record within 6 hours, retransmitted across the same networks that had carried Osei's broadcast. The Thun cooperative had not been defeated. They had made a calculation. The calculation was this: a blockade of Earth's moon, if maintained, would require the cooperative to also be prepared for a counter-escalation by Earth at a point of the cooperative's vulnerability. The cooperative had identified one point at which it was willing to demonstrate force, and had found, when Earth did not retreat from that demonstration, that the counterposition was more costly than the original demonstration was worth. This was a rational calculation. I respected it, in the abstract way you respect a well-reasoned argument from someone you disagree with. I called Callaway to commend the operation. She was characteristically brief in her acknowledgement and asked immediately what the next orders were. Hold position for another 6 hours, I said. Then return to Fleet Assembly Point on a visible heading. Same approach as before. No hiding, no evasion. Let the scanners see you come and go. Understood. Any communication with Thun Command in the interim. If they contact you, respond honestly and briefly. If they don't contact you, no outreach from our end. And if they ask why we're leaving? I thought about that for a moment. Tell them we are satisfied that the relevant information has been communicated and that further presence is not necessary at this time. Yes, Admiral. I ended the call and went back to the operations display. The overall picture had changed significantly in 9 days. The fleet was positioned and operating openly. 14 stations had received document deliveries that were now in the formal record. The broadcast had reached a majority of inhabited space. The Thun blockade had come and gone. The conclave's formal response posture was still being developed. Their legal offices were visibly active across the monitoring channels, which meant people were working overtime and not reaching easy conclusions. The 3 abstaining delegations had made no public statements, which was consistent with what I would expect from governments watching a situation carefully before committing to a visible position. And somewhere in this moving picture, the galaxy was adjusting. Not to us specifically, not yet, but to the information, to the demonstrated reality that exile had not produced the contained and manageable situation the vote had been intended to produce, that humanity in open space, operating by its own logic and its own law, was something different from what the 421 voting delegations had apparently modeled in their planning. They had modeled a species that would retreat, that would absorb a formal rebuke and reduce its ambitions accordingly. the way you expect a smaller animal to back down when a larger one raises its height. We had not retreated. We had not raised our height, either. We had simply kept moving in the direction we had already been moving, with the patience and the precision of a species that decided a very long time ago that the only acceptable outcome was survival, and that survival required the willingness to be exactly what you are, in exactly the space you choose to occupy. Commander Nair appeared at my office door. She had a tablet with updated communication logs. "Something interesting," she said. "Tell me." 17 independent species have transmitted formal inquiries to Geneva in the last 6 hours. Not to the Conclave, directly to Geneva. Trade inquiries, 3 of them. 6 requests for diplomatic contact establishment. 2 scientific exchange proposals. 4 requests for access to our hyperspace mapping data. I looked at her. "The galaxy," she said carefully, "is doing the math." The math was simple. The Conclave had voted to exile a civilization that had subsequently demonstrated, in 9 days, that it had a fleet no one knew about, a legal team that had read every relevant statute more carefully than the people who wrote them, a communications strategy that had reached 60% of the known galaxy without Conclave infrastructure, and the patience to park a destroyer next to someone else's fuel supply and just wait. 17 inquiries in 6 hours. More would come. "Forward them all to Geneva," I said. "Flag them as priority, and tell the diplomatic team to take their time responding." "How much time?" "Enough time for the people asking to understand that we are responding because we choose to, not because we were waiting for someone to ask." She nodded and went to send the forward. I turned back to the operations display. The exile stood, technically. The decree was on the Conclave's record. Nothing had changed that. Everything else was changing, and changing fast, and the direction of the change was not what 421 votes had intended. I thought about the message the Conclave had sent requesting a clarification meeting. I thought about 17 trade inquiries. I thought about 40 ships withdrawing from Earth's moon without a shot fired. Then I thought about Ambassador Osei, in whatever undisclosed location she had chosen, and about the 4th law she had spoken about in that broadcast. We remember kindness. We remember everything, the whole of it, the harm and the kindness and the abstentions and the quiet acts of fairness that happen in the spaces between the formal votes, where nobody is watching, and the math of political convenience does not clearly favor decency. That was the part the galaxy had not calculated for. It had calculated for our ships, and our legal arguments, and our economic leverage, and our willingness to hold position in uncomfortable spaces. All of that was there, in the evidence, available to anyone who had paid close attention for 17 years. What it had not calculated for was how long we carry the good things. As long as the bad ones. Exactly as long. That was going to matter. It was going to matter in ways that no single operation, and no single broadcast, and no fleet movement could demonstrate. It was going to take time. Years, possibly. The patient kind of change that builds from 3 abstentions and 37 media retransmissions, and 17 trade inquiries, slowly and steadily, into something the galaxy's maps would eventually need to account for. We had time. We always have time. 17 vessels in open space, 1 destroyer at a gas giant, 416 media retransmissions, 17 trade inquiries. Day 9. The real work had not even started yet. 3 days after the Thun blockade withdrew, I received a communication that I had been half expecting and half hoping would not come. It was from the Drevali hegemony. The Drevali were a mid-tier conclave power, not as influential as the Velkari or the Thun, but not marginal either. They controlled 4 inhabited systems, a significant manufacturing base, and a diplomatic reputation built carefully over centuries on the perception of being reliably predictable. Whatever the dominant bloc did, the Drevali generally aligned with, just slightly behind, which kept them in good standing with whoever was currently powerful, without requiring them to take many risks. They had voted in favor of the exile. Obviously. Of course they had. But the message they sent was not from their government. It was from a private commercial entity, the Drevali Trade House of Fenath and Successors, which was one of the largest privately held trading organizations in the Eastern Galactic Arm. Not a government, not a military body, a business, reaching out to another business through private commercial channels that were not, technically, covered by the exile provisions. The message was brief, professional, entirely opaque about the sender's actual purpose, in the way that a very experienced commercial entity is opaque when it is feeling out a situation without wanting to create a formal record of having done so. They wanted to discuss terms for a direct trade relationship with Earth, not through the Conclave's trade framework, directly. I forwarded the message to Geneva with a note that said simply, "This is the first of several." I was right. By the end of that week, 5 more private commercial inquiries had arrived through similar channels, not through conclave frameworks, not through official government channels, through the commercial routes that had always existed in parallel with the formal structures, because commerce does not stop for politics, and trade does not wait for decrees to be resolved. The exile had cut Earth off from the conclave's formal trade infrastructure. It had not cut us off from the galaxy's economic reality, because the galaxy's economic reality operated according to its own logic, and that logic said that Earth was a producer of things other civilizations wanted, and a consumer of things other civilizations could provide, and no formal decree changes that basic arithmetic. What the exile had done was remove the conclave as the intermediary. What I was watching, from my operations display, was the galaxy quietly beginning to route around the conclave, the way a river routes around a boulder. Not dramatically, not all at once. Individual economic actors, making individual decisions, finding the path of least resistance toward an outcome that served their interests. It was going to be slow, slower than the operations, slower than the broadcast, slower than watching 40 ships turn around. But it was going to be thorough, in a way that none of the other things were. I did not write this in my operations log. I wrote it in the same personal journal I had been keeping since taking command, the one that was encrypted and personal, and said things the formal record did not need to contain. I wrote, "The conclave voted to exile a trading civilization from a trading galaxy. They may not yet understand what they have done. They will." Then I closed the journal and went to conduct the fleet's daily readiness review, because whatever was happening in the galaxy's economic consciousness, 17 ships still needed to be operational, and their crews needed to be sharp. The readiness review took 2 hours. Everything was nominal. The long quiet had been hard on morale in the expected ways, but it had also produced something I had not entirely anticipated. A fleet that was, in a specific and genuine sense, very good at waiting, not passive waiting, active waiting, the kind where you are fully prepared to move the instant the signal comes, and fully at peace with the absence of the signal until it does. There is a word for that in one of the older human languages. A language from a region where people had to be ready for conditions that could change without warning, in environments that were not forgiving of unpreparedness. The word does not translate well into galactic standard. It means something like, the calm of someone who has done everything that can be done, and is now ready for whatever comes. The fleet had that, all 17 ships. After the readiness review, I went to eat dinner in the officers' mess, and ended up in a long conversation with the Rubicon's chief engineer, a woman named Laura Kent who had been with the ship for 8 years, and who had opinions about everything, and was not shy about sharing them. She had watched the broadcast. She wanted to talk about it. "The fourth law," she said. "I keep thinking about it." "What about it?" "My grandmother used to say something similar," she said. "Not about civilizations, just about people." She said, "You can tell everything you need to know about a person by how they treat someone who can't do anything for them." I thought about that. Osei was saying something slightly different, not about powerlessness, about genuine kindness, the kind that costs something. Like abstaining when everyone else is voting the other way. Yes. She drank her coffee. "Do you think the 3 abstentions matter, in the long run? Or do you think they're going to get lost in everything else that's happening?" It was a good question, the kind of question that does not have a certain answer. "I think they matter most when the other things settle down," I said. "Right now there's a lot happening. The fleet, the operations, the broadcast, the Thuan situation, all of it is moving fast and loud and visible. 3 abstentions are a quiet thing. They don't make noise. They're easy to overlook in all the other noise. But noise fades. What's built on something solid lasts longer." She nodded. "Ambassador Osei is going to go meet them, isn't she? The 3. She is. And you?" I am going to maintain a fleet in open space and make sure the Conclave's legal offices have a great deal to think about, I said. That is my contribution to the long-term situation. She laughed. It was a good sound in the mess hall of a ship that had been dark for 8 months. We sat there for another half hour talking about nothing in particular, about the long quiet, about her grandmother, about what the Rubicon's crew was going to do with leave when this phase of operations concluded, and leave was a thing that was possible again. Normal things. The kind of things that people talk about when they are in the middle of something enormous, and they need to remember that they are, also, and continuously, just people. Outside the hull of the Rubicon, 17 ships held position in open space. Beyond them, in the gas giant orbital space of the Thune home system, Calloway's group had completed its 6-hour hold and begun the return transit to the fleet assembly point. Beyond them, in the wider galaxy, the economic inquiries were accumulating, and the media retransmissions were spreading, and the Conclave's legal teams were working late in ways that showed up in the patterns of their communication traffic. And in 3 places, in 3 different jurisdictions, 3 beings who had abstained on a vote that 421 others had decided were holding their own internal conversations about what came next. We were holding our own conversations too. That was the thing. At the end of all the analysis and all the operations and all the strategic planning and all the carefully worded broadcasts, we were not done talking. We were not done listening. We were not done building relationships and making records and remembering things. We were, if anything, only just getting started. And that, more than the fleet, more than the legal arguments, more than the operations that had made it impossible for the Conclave to pretend the exile was having its intended effect, was the thing that the galaxy had most consistently failed to account for in all its decades of managing its relationship with humanity. We are not a crisis. We are a civilization. Civilizations do not end when someone votes them out of a room. Civilizations build other rooms. We had been building rooms since before the Conclave was founded. We would still be building them long after the exile decree had faded from being a current event to being a historical footnote. And the rooms we built would be the kind that remembered who had helped with the foundation. That was the plan. That had always been the plan. Everything else was just getting the conditions right for it to work. The meeting took place on a station that belonged to no government. My name is Yara Osei, and I had requested the meeting through channels so indirect that the invitations themselves were works of careful construction. Not secret, exactly. The Conclave was aware, in a general sense, that Earth's former ambassador was engaged in outreach activities. They simply could not identify with precision where those activities were happening, or who they were happening with, which was exactly the kind of imprecision I had worked very hard to create. The station was a fueling and maintenance waypoint in a region of space that served as a kind of informal border between 3 different jurisdictions, without belonging definitively to any of them. It had operated for 60 years on the principle that its usefulness to everyone depended on its being claimed by no one. Every major power in the region used it. Every major power in the region allowed it to exist because the alternative was to claim it, at which point every other power would immediately have a reason to stop using it, and the entire value of the thing would disappear. It was a very logical arrangement. Humans would have called it neutral ground. The Velkari called it something that translated roughly as the space where arguments rest. The Thune had no word for it, because the concept of shared neutral space did not map well onto their collective biology, which is perhaps part of why the Thune were not at this meeting. The 3 who had abstained came in small ships, by routes that were varied and indirect. None of them traveled with a government designation visible in their transponders. They were private individuals, as far as any scanner was concerned, visiting a waypoint station for the entirely unremarkable purpose of refueling and maintenance. I arrived the day before, with Colin and 2 security personnel whose job was to be present rather than to do anything specific. The station's administrator, a being of a small species I had never encountered before, who communicated through color shifts in a membrane behind her eyes and whose translator gave her a warm and slightly formal voice, knew who her guests were and said nothing to anyone about it. This was the kind of facility where knowing things and saying them were considered 2 entirely separate activities. The meeting room was small, a table, 6 chairs of varying design, because the station kept chairs appropriate for a wide range of species on hand. A single high window showing open space. No recording equipment of any kind, which I had confirmed personally before the others arrived. The Areth San ambassador arrived first. Their name, rendered into sounds a human could produce, was something close to Te-Soral. They were tall by human standards, and thin in the way of beings whose biology had developed under lighter gravity than Earth's, and they moved with the careful deliberateness of someone who has spent considerable time in environments not calibrated for their physical form. Te-Soral sat across from me and looked at me for a long moment, with the large, forward-facing eyes that made the Areth San's gaze feel more direct than most species managed. Then they spoke, through their translator, in a voice that carried the slight pressure shift undertone of their natural communication, even in its translated form. "You look tired," they said. "I have been busy," I said. "We watched the broadcast," they said. "All of it. Several times. I hope it was useful." "It was honest," Te-Soral said. "Which is not always the same as useful, but in this case I believe it was both." The Pale Communion of Vesh arrived 20 minutes later in the form of their senior representative, whose name I will not attempt to reproduce here, because it contained sound frequencies outside human vocal range. The translator rendered a workable equivalent. Vesh was a small civilization by conclave standards. Only 2 inhabited systems, a modest fleet, a philosophical tradition that was the oldest continuously maintained intellectual framework in known space. They had abstained on the exile vote, not for strategic reasons but because the communion had concluded, through a process that took 5 months and involved approximately 300 scholars, that the vote was ethically wrong. Simple as that. Wrong, and therefore not something the communion could support, regardless of what the political cost of abstaining might be. I had the deepest respect for that kind of decision-making. The Velkari council member was last. She came alone, without any aides or security, which was itself a statement about the nature of her situation. Her name was Ven Areth, and she was not, at the moment of her arrival, a council member in any formal sense. She had resigned her position 3 days after the vote, as the internal pressure from her government made continuing in that role unworkable. She was, technically, a private citizen. She sat down, and I looked at all 3 of them, Te-Soral, and the Vesh representative, and Ven Areth. And for a moment, I did not say anything at all. I just let the fact of the meeting exist for a breath. Then I said, "You abstained." "Yes," said Te-Soral. "Yes," said the Vesh representative. Ven Areth said, "I voted differently from my government, which means I abstained in the formal record, because a Velkari council member's dissenting vote registers as abstention under the block voting rules, rather than as a direct opposing vote." A pause. "It cost me my position." "I know," I said. "I am sorry." "I am not," she said. "I would do it again." I nodded. "Why?" She looked at me steadily. "Because I have a daughter. She is 11 years old. She is growing up in a galaxy that just voted to exile an entire civilization based on fear of what they might do. And I want her to understand, from the evidence of her own family's choices, that the correct response to fear is not to make the feared thing into an enemy." The room was quiet after that for a moment. Te-Soral spoke. "We did it because we have read your history." "Which parts?" I asked. "All of it," they said. "Not the summary the Conclave's cultural assessment team produced. The actual history. We assigned 3 scholars to do nothing but read human historical records for 2 years. Not to analyze them, just to read them, in as close to the original form as our translation tools allowed. That is a significant investment," I said. "It was necessary," Te-Soral said. "We do not vote on things we do not understand." We had been voting on measures related to humanity for 11 years, based on the Conclave's summary assessments. And those assessments, while factually accurate in most of their specific claims, were missing something. Something important. What were they missing? Te-Soral was quiet for a moment. The pressure shift undertone of their natural voice came through more strongly, which their translator had taught me, indicated something between emotion and certainty. They were missing the through line, Te-Soral said. The summaries described incidents. Specific cases of human behavior that the Conclave found concerning. They were accurate descriptions, but they described the parts without describing the whole. What the scholars found, reading the actual history, was not a species that was dangerous in a random or chaotic way. It was a species with a consistent internal logic. a logic that the conclave's assessments had not identified because the assessors were looking for threats rather than understanding. I thought about that. What is the logic? You believe in reciprocity, Te Soral said. At the deepest level, not as a strategy, as a foundational principle. You respond to harm with harm, and to kindness with kindness, and you remember both with equal clarity, and you do not forgive easily, but you do not hold grudges indefinitely either. You have a concept. They paused while their translator worked. What translates approximately as justice, not revenge. You seek balance, not advantage. I looked at them for a long time. That is a very accurate description, I said quietly. It is not what the conclave's assessment described, Te Soral said. The conclave's assessment described a species with dangerous capabilities and inconsistent behavior, which is true in some specifics, but it is not the most important truth about you. The most important truth is the one that makes the capability and the behavior comprehensible. You are a justice-seeking species. You respond to the world according to what you believe you are owed and what you owe. That is not the same as being dangerous, even if it produces dangerous-seeming behavior in situations where you believe you are being treated unjustly. The Vesh representative spoke for the first time. Their voice, through the translator, was careful and precise, in a way that reflected the communion's long tradition of philosophical precision. We abstained because the exile was unjust, they said. That is the complete reason. The communion does not require more justification than that. If an action is unjust, we do not support it. If we must pay a price for refusing to support injustice, we pay it. We have paid larger prices in the past. The conclave pressured you? I asked. Predictably, the Vesh representative said. They reminded us of the secondary sanctions provisions for non-cooperation with exile enforcement. We reminded them that secondary sanctions require a finding of active support for the exiled party, and abstaining is not active support. They reminded us that the finding of active support was within the conclave's discretionary authority. We reminded them that discretionary authority, exercised in a clearly retaliatory manner, was subject to the conclave's own ethics tribunal process, which we were prepared to initiate. And? They declined to make the finding, the Vesh representative said. The conclave has a strong interest in maintaining the perception that its processes are legitimate. Sanctions against a member state for refusing to vote in a specific way would undermine that perception in ways they calculated they could not afford. I nodded. Another edge case in the legal framework. Another place where someone had read the rules carefully enough to find the space that the rules actually permitted. Venoreth had been listening quietly to all of this. She spoke now. I need to tell you something, she said. Something about the Velkari government's internal discussions before the vote. I am telling you this as a private citizen, not as a former official. I am not violating any confidentiality obligation that applies to information I did not obtain through my official role. I am sharing something I know from other sources. I understand, I said. There was significant debate within the government about the vote, she said. Not about whether to support the exile. There was a clear majority for that position throughout the discussion. The debate was about the framing, about whether to frame the vote as a permanent measure or as a temporary containment response pending renegotiation. I said nothing. I was listening very carefully. The faction that wanted permanent framing won, Van Aerith said, because they made the argument that a temporary framing would give Earth's government an incentive to wait out the containment period and re-emerge with enhanced leverage once the temporary measure expired. A permanent measure, they argued, was more likely to produce a significant behavioral change in Earth's leadership. They were wrong about that, I said. Yes, she said simply. They were wrong, and I think some of them knew it, but the political logic of voting for the stronger appearing measure was clearer in the moment than the strategic logic of what it would actually produce. This was, in its way, one of the most useful pieces of information anyone had given me since the vote, not because it told me anything I had not suspected, but because it confirmed the nature of the mistake that had been made. The conclave had not exiled us because they believed exile would work. They had exiled us because they believed exile was the option that required the least political vulnerability from the species who supported it. It was a vote driven by internal political logic, not by an accurate external assessment. That did not make it less real in its effects. but it made it legible in a way that affected how we should respond going forward. I looked at all three of them. What I am going to say now is not official Earth government policy, I said. It is not a treaty proposal, or a diplomatic offer, or a negotiating position. It is a personal statement from me, as a private individual, to three people who have done something that cost them something and that I believe mattered. They were all watching me. We remember kindness, I said. I said that in the broadcast, and I meant it exactly as I said it. But I want to say something more specific than that here, in this room, with no recording and no official record. The fourth law is not a strategy. It is not designed to reward useful behavior or to create incentives for future cooperation. It is a description of who we are. We carry gratitude the same way we carry everything, permanently, with precision. And what I am telling you, as specifically and honestly as I know how to be, is that what you three did on the day of that vote is something I will carry for the rest of my life. Not because it was strategically useful, though it was, but because it was right. Because 421 other delegations had a clear and obvious political incentive to vote yes, and you found, each of you in your own way, a reason to choose differently. That is a human thing to do, I said. Choosing differently, when the cost of choosing differently is real. We have a deep respect for it because we have a very long history of watching what happens to the civilizations that consistently choose the safe option instead of the right one. Venereth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What happens to them?" "They survive," I said. "For a long time, usually. Safety is effective at producing survival, but they tend to find, eventually, that safety purchased by consistently choosing the wrong thing leaves them in a world they have helped make worse, surrounded by the consequences of choices they made when they could have made different ones." She nodded, very slowly. The Vesh representative said, "You are describing a long view." "We always take the long view," I said. "It is one of the things that frightens other species about us. It should not. It just means we are thinking about the consequences of today's choices in terms of what they produce over decades rather than years, which is, frankly, the only sensible way to make decisions of this magnitude." Texeral said, "What do you want from this meeting, Ambassador?" "Ose," I said. "I resigned the ambassadorship." "Yara, then, what do you want?" I thought about how to answer that honestly. "I want a record," I said at last. "Not an official one, a personal one. I want to know, from your own accounts, why you made the choices you made, because those choices are going to matter over the next years, in ways none of us can fully predict, and the reason behind a choice is the thing that determines how it extends into future situations. I want to understand the reason so that I understand the people, and understanding the people is the foundation of everything I believe actually matters in the long run." A long pause. "That is a very patient answer," Tehe said. "We are a very patient species," I said, "when the thing we are being patient about is worth it." We talked for 4 more hours. I asked questions, and I listened to answers, and I did not take notes in any form, because notes can be found. What I was doing was the older and more reliable form of record-keeping, the one that human beings had been doing since long before they had writing. I was listening with full attention and committing what I heard to the memory that I would carry out of that room and keep for the rest of my life. 4 hours, 3 people, their reasons, their costs, their assessments, their hopes. By the end, I understood all 3 of them well enough to know that the understanding would be useful. Not today, not in the immediate phases still to come, but in the longer work. When we finally stood to leave, Venereth said something to me quietly at the door, something she had held back throughout the earlier conversation. "The faction in my government," she said, "the one that argued for permanent framing. The head of that faction is currently preparing a proposal for the next conclave session, a proposal to formalize the enforcement mechanisms of the exile." "I know," I said. "We have been watching the communication traffic." She looked at me for a moment. "You are not worried?" "We have read the enforcement mechanism provisions," I said. "The proposed structure requires unanimous consent from the relevant jurisdictions for implementation. There are currently 11 jurisdictions that have indicated, through various channels, that they will not consent." She processed this. 11, she said. "And growing," I said. "The economic inquiry rate is increasing. When economic relationships develop, the practical interest in enforcement decreases correspondingly. She was quiet for a moment. You planned for this, she said. We planned for the possibility, I said. We hoped we would not need the plan, but we made it, because that is what we do. She left, and I stood at the door for a moment after she had gone, and I thought about what she had not quite said, but had clearly been thinking. She had been thinking, you were always going to be fine. And she was right. We were always going to be fine, in the structural sense, the operational sense, the strategic sense, the legal sense. We had made sure of that before the vote happened. But fine was not the goal. The goal was what came after fine, the long, patient, difficult work of building a galaxy that our children and their children would not need to defend themselves in the same way we had. A galaxy where 3 abstentions became 30, and 30 became a majority, and the majority reflected something true about the relationship between humanity and the rest of the species that shared this enormous and extraordinary universe. That goal was decades away, maybe generations. We were patient. I walked back to the dock where my ship was waiting, and the station administrator was at the corridor junction, color shifts in her eye membrane expressing something that her translator rendered as a formal and genuine farewell. I thanked her for the use of the facility. She said, through her translator, that she hoped the meeting had been useful, and that she hoped whoever had met here would find what they were looking for. I said that I thought we had made a start. She said that was usually enough. I agreed that it usually was. My ship lifted away from the station, and I sat in the small passenger compartment and looked at the window at the same stars I had been looking at from various angles for 11 years, and I thought about what came next. The broadcast had been the statement. The operations had been the demonstration. The meeting had been the beginning. What came after was the rest of it, the part that did not fit into a single act, or a single speech, or a single fleet movement, the part that happened in the accumulation of small things over long periods of time, the way rivers shape rock, not through force, but through presence. We were going to be present. We had always been going to be present. The galaxy was going to need to learn how to be a galaxy that included us, because we were not going anywhere, and we were not going to become something smaller than what we were to make that easier. But we were going to give them every possible reason to want us here. That was the 4th law, extended outward into time. We remember kindness. And we give people reasons to be kind. Both. Always. 6 months after the vote, the exile technically still stands. My name is Yara Osei, and I want to tell you what technically means. Technically, Earth is exiled from the Galactic Conclave. The decree is on their record. The documentation is current, filed, and referenced in official conclave communications whenever the subject arises, which is less often than you might expect from a body that spent 2 years building a legal case for the action. Technically, the hyperspace embargo is in effect. Our vessels are prohibited from using conclave-controlled hyperspace infrastructure without specific authorization from the relevant administrative bodies. This prohibition is enforced at 3 of the 11 monitoring stations that were originally designated for embargo enforcement. The other 8 have, through a series of administrative decisions, procedural reviews, and one rather remarkable joint jurisdictional dispute between 2 conclave member species about exactly which body had enforcement authority over a specific corridor segment, become effectively inoperative. We use alternate routes. We mapped them a long time ago. They are slightly longer than the conclave's primary lanes in some cases. In other cases, they are not. Technically, trade with Earth is embargoed for all conclave member species. This prohibition applies to formal, declared trade arrangements conducted through conclave-registered channels. The Fenath Trade House, the 11 other private commercial entities that have established direct arrangements with Earth in the last 6 months, and the 7 member governments that have quietly opened what their lawyers are calling research exchange programs with no formal trade classification, are all operating in a different category. Our trade volume has not decreased. It has increased by slightly more than 30% since the exile vote. Technically, anyone providing material assistance to Earth faces secondary sanctions. The 11 jurisdictions that have indicated non-consent to enforcement have been joined by 4 more in the last 6 weeks. Secondary sanctions require a finding by the Enforcement Committee, which requires a quorum, which requires participation by jurisdictions that are not currently participating. The Conclave has not formally acknowledged any of this. They have issued no statement revising the exile decree, no announcement of changed enforcement policy, no formal recognition that the situation has evolved in ways that do not reflect the decree's original intent. The decree stands on paper exactly as it was written. In practice, the galaxy has moved on. Not all at once, not completely, not in a way that can be declared officially, or pointed to in a single moment, and called a resolution. It has moved the way things actually move in a galaxy full of civilizations, with competing interests and long memories, and pragmatic economic needs. Slowly, messily, through individual decisions made by individual actors, for individual reasons that add up, eventually, to a different reality than the one the paper describes. I am standing in a small office in Geneva. The office belongs to the Foreign Policy Division of the United Earth Government, and it is an ordinary room. A window showing afternoon light on a clear day, a desk with a surface covered in the organized disorder of ongoing work, a chair I have been sitting in for most of the last 3 weeks. The walls have 2 small pictures on them. One is a photograph taken from the surface of the moon of Earth, rising above the lunar horizon. The other is a map of the galactic arm, with Earth's position marked, and, in the 6 months since I put it up, a slowly growing number of lines drawn to it in blue ink. Each blue line represents a direct relationship, not a conclave-mediated arrangement, not an approved framework, a direct relationship with an entity that chose to have it. There are 31 lines now. I add them as they develop. I do not add them when the relationship is established. I wait until it has been tested at least once, until something has come up that required both parties to make a decision about whether the relationship was real enough to maintain. 31 have passed that test. I am not going to tell you that everything is fine. It is not entirely fine. There are jurisdictions that will not deal with us, and will not for years. There are conclave member governments whose domestic political pressures make any softening of their official position extremely difficult, regardless of what their private inclinations might be. There are genuine disputes that need resolution, not the manufactured grievances of the conclave's exile proceedings, but real disagreements about resource access and travel rights, and the specific terms of arrangements that are being negotiated for the first time, without any established framework to guide them. That work is hard. It will continue to be hard. But it is different work from what came before. It is the work of building, rather than the work of defending the right to build. It is the work of negotiation, rather than the work of fighting for the standing to negotiate. That difference matters, in a way that is difficult to articulate precisely, but that I feel every time I sit down across from someone and open a discussion that I know will reach a conclusion, however complicated, because both parties have chosen to be there. Fleet Admiral Vasquez keeps the fleet in position. Not 17 ships anymore. 3 of the carrier platforms have returned to the Sol system for refit and crew rotation, and 2 of the destroyers are now operating in a different sector on a different assignment. The core group remains in open space, visible and operational, maintaining a presence that the Conclave's monitoring systems log every day without doing anything about, because there is nothing to do about it. The Conclave requested the clarification meeting twice more after the first request. We responded to the third request. The meeting was held 6 weeks ago, through intermediaries, in a format that allowed both sides to participate, without either one formally acknowledging that they were currently in a dispute requiring resolution. It was an elaborate and somewhat exhausting piece of diplomatic theater, and it produced nothing immediately except a mutual understanding that future meetings were possible. That is not nothing. In my experience, future meetings are possible is where every eventual resolution begins. It is the most boring and most important sentence in diplomacy. Commander Elon Sharp was promoted to captain 2 months ago. His operational record during the station visits was formally included in the promotion recommendation. The Conclave's legal offices know his name now, in the abstract sense that people become known for doing something unprecedented and doing it well. He is a figure in the galactic conversation, in a way that he was not 6 months ago. He remains uncomfortable with this. He told me, at his promotion ceremony, that he would prefer to be remembered for doing things well, rather than for being the first one to do a specific unusual thing. I told him that those 2 things tend to go together in the historical record, fairly or not. He accepted this without apparent comfort, and immediately started asking about his next assignment. I have a great deal of respect for that. Owen Gibbs finished his novel. He sent me a copy. He was right that the middle section drags a little, but the ending is good. The kind of ending that rewards patience in a way that makes you feel, looking back, that the pacing of the middle was intentional, rather than a flaw. I am not sure it was intentional, but I am also not sure that matters. Colin Hart is still my assistant, though the nature of the work has changed enough that the title no longer quite captures what he does. He has become, in practice, something closer to a coordinator for the growing network of direct relationships we are maintaining, tracking the 31 lines on my map and the communications that flow through them, and the decisions that need to be made about when and how to respond to new inquiries. He is very good at it. He asked me recently whether he should consider pursuing formal diplomatic training. I told him he was already doing it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said that was a compliment, and also a non-answer. I agreed that it was both, and suggested he pursue the formal training as well if he wanted it, because the combination of what he was learning in practice and what he would learn formally would make him something remarkable. He is thinking about it. The Velkari council member, Ven Arith, accepted a position with a private consultancy in the Velkari Cooperative 3 months after her resignation. The consultancy works on galactic economic relations, advising commercial clients on cross-jurisdictional arrangements. Several of those arrangements involve Earth. This connection is not hidden and not advertised. It exists, and it works, and the people who need to know about it know about it. She reached out to me last month to report that her daughter had asked, on reading the transcript of the broadcast, whether the fourth law meant that humanity would remember their family. Ven Arith had told her yes. Her daughter had said she thought that was a good way to be. I think about that sometimes. The 11-year-old who asked the question, and the mother who had to think about how to answer it, and the answer being so simple that a child found it immediately satisfying. That is the thing about the fourth law. It is the most complicated of the four in terms of what it actually requires of us. Memory is more demanding than response, because response has a beginning and an end and memory does not. But it is also the simplest to explain. You remember the people who did the right thing when it cost them something. You remember them specifically, not in the general way of goodwill toward those who were fair, but in the specific way of knowing their names and their choices, and the cost they paid, and carrying all of it with the same weight that you carry the things done against you. And when circumstances eventually bring you back into contact with those people or their successors, you let what you remember be visible, not as a strategy, as a truth. 31 lines on a map, most of them in blue, a few in other colors that represent more complicated relationships still being defined. A growing number of new inquiries that have not yet been converted to lines because the test has not yet come. The fleet in open space, visible, operational. The legal teams reading every new conclave proceeding with the same careful attention they have maintained since the beginning. The 3 names in my journal, and the conversations that grew from those names, and the work that grows from those conversations. And somewhere, in this office, and in the fleet's operations room, and in the consultancy office of a former council member, and in the border territories where an independent journalist writes stories that 416 outlets want to carry, the slow and patient and absolutely unstoppable process of humanity, building something in the galaxy that will still be here when all of this is a history lesson. I look at the map. I look at the 31 lines. I pick up my pen and draw the 32nd. This one connects to a system I will not name specifically, belonging to a species that has no formal relationship with Earth, and never has, and whose government voted in favor of the exile without a dissenting voice. The connection is not with their government. It is with a research institution, operating at the edge of what their government's official policy permits, pursuing a project that requires data that Earth has, and they need. They reached out carefully. We responded carefully. We established a careful arrangement that stays clearly within the defined boundaries of what both parties' situations permit. It is not dramatic. It will not make news on any of the 416 outlets. It will not change the number on the conclave's vote record, or alter the language of the exile decree. But it is a line on the map, and the map has 32 lines now, and 6 months ago it had none. I put the pen down. Outside the window, the afternoon is becoming evening. The light through the glass is the particular color that comes just before sunset, when the sky is still bright, but the warmth has gone, and everything takes on a quality of clarity that you only get in the last minutes before dark. I have always thought it was the most honest light of the day, not the full, uncomplicated brightness of midday, not the atmospheric drama of the actual sunset, but the clear, precise, somewhat cool light of late afternoon, when things look exactly like what they are. Earth looks exactly like what it is in that light. A planet. One planet among an enormous number, orbiting an unremarkable star, in an arm of a galaxy so large that the light from its far edge started traveling before life existed here. Small, in the most objective possible sense. Smaller than most of the worlds that belong to the Conclave's major members. Younger, by geological standards, than many of the civilizations that voted to exile us. Small and young, and absolutely, completely, stubbornly, joyfully alive, in a way that, when you see it honestly, in the right light, makes the exile vote look like exactly what it was. A very large institution trying to manage something it did not understand. And humanity, patient as rock and stubborn as water, doing what it has always done when the thing it is declared inconvenient. Being it anyway. More so. With better records and longer memory, and the specific kind of confidence that comes not from believing nothing can harm you, but from having survived everything that has tried. The 32nd line on the map. The 33rd is already waiting. The inquiry came in this morning. I will respond tomorrow. There is always work to do. There is always another line to draw. There is always another conversation to begin, another relationship to test, another cost to pay for the choice to keep doing this, instead of accepting the version of things that someone else voted for. That is not a complaint. It is a description of what we chose to be, and choosing it is not a hardship when the alternative is the kind of safety that purchases itself with smallness. We are not small. We were never small. The Galactic Conclave voted on what we were, and they reached a conclusion, and they were not wrong about everything they identified in that conclusion. We are complicated. We are persistent. We are, in the specific and measurable sense, capable of being very dangerous in the situations that require it. What they got wrong, what the 421 got wrong, and what the 3 abstentions understood, each in their own way, is what that combination of qualities actually means in the long run. It does not mean a threat waiting to explode. It means a civilization that will still be building long after the people who voted against it have become a historical footnote in the civilization it built. The exile technically stands. We are adding a 33rd line to the map. Both things are true. For now, the second one matters more. For now, the second one is doing what it was always going to do. What it was built to do. What we always build things to do. Last.